By the end of May 1918, the French government had already drawn up plans to evacuate Paris. Think about that for a second. Not as a historical footnote, but as a lived reality. Bureaucrats were packing crates. Diplomats were mapping escape routes. The city that had stood as the cultural and political nerve center of Western Europe was 72 kilometers, roughly 40 miles, from the nearest German spearhead, and the lines protecting it were collapsing by the hour. The German spring offensive had driven through Allied positions like a punch through wet paper. Operation Blücher York, launched May 27th, had ripped a 40-mile hole in the French front in less than 3 days, the fastest advance on the Western Front since the war began. French divisions that had held for 3 years were retreating westward, some in good order, many not. The roads south of the Marne were clogged with soldiers and civilians moving the same direction, away. When American units of the 2nd Division were rushed forward to shore up the line near the Marne River, the first thing they saw was French officers waving them back. One French officer reportedly told a Marine colonel to turn his men around because the situation was lost. The colonel in question did not turn his men around. The forest they were asked to hold, and then to attack, was called Belleau Wood. A hunting preserve before the war, roughly 3 kilometers long by 1 kilometer wide, dense with oak and beech and riddled with boulders that German machine gun teams had spent the previous days turning into fortified nests. The Germans had dug in well. They had the high ground, the cover, the prepared fields of fire, and weeks of preparation behind them. What they did not account for was who was walking toward them. The question that has stuck with me every time I go back through the personal accounts from this battle is a simple one. What does it take for men to cross an open wheat field, 300 meters of waist-high grain, no cover, no concealment, while German Maxim machine guns are already firing? Because that is exactly what the Marines of the 4th Brigade did on the afternoon of June 6, 1918. They rose from the tree line and walked forward, then ran, into fire that could deliver 600 rounds per minute per gun, and there were multiple guns. June 6, 1918 cost the Marine Brigade 31 officers and 1,056 enlisted men killed or wounded, the highest single-day loss in the history of the United States Marine Corps to that point, surpassing every engagement the Corps had ever fought in its entire 143 years of existence. The wheat was cut down by the fire. So were the men, and they kept going. Part of what makes this battle different from most of what had been happening on the Western Front is the way it bled at human scale rather than industrial scale. This was not a battle of artillery weeks and barbed wire months. This was rifle ranges of 30 meters, bayonets, hand-to-hand fighting in boulder fields, Marines clearing one machine gun nest and then crawling through undergrowth to find the next one, over and over, for 26 days. The wood changed hands 6 times in portions before it was finally secured. Men fought through gas without masks when masks were lost, choked on phosgene and kept moving. A Marine named Sergeant Dan Daly, who had already earned 2 Medals of Honor in 2 separate wars before June 1918, reportedly called to his men as they stalled under fire. "Come on, you sons of bitches. Do you want to live forever?" Whether the exact words are apocryphal or not, the spirit was completely in keeping with what the records show those men actually did. The Germans noticed. Their intelligence reports from mid-June described the American Marines with a specific term that entered permanent military law: Teufelhunden, devil dogs. The precise grammatical origin of the phrase has been debated by scholars, but the sentiment in the German assessments was not in doubt. These were not the green, inexperienced Americans the German High Command had dismissed in their planning. These were men who did not behave the way Western Front veterans behaved. Men who had not been worn down by years of trench stalemate. Men who did not automatically take cover when the fire got heavy. On June 26, 1918, Major Maurice Shearer sent a message to Brigadier General James Harbord that became one of the most concise dispatches in American military history. Belleau Wood, now US Marine Corps entirely. 25 words. The wood was cleared. The German push toward Paris had stalled and would never seriously recover. The last major German offensive of the war had broken against a forest in northern France, held by men who had refused an order to retreat. The final bill was 9,827 American casualties, 1,811 dead, 7,966 wounded, for a forest 3 kilometers long. German casualties are estimated at over 8,600, with 1,600 taken prisoner. The Marines who came out of Belleau Wood were not the same institution that entered it, and neither was the world's perception of American military power. What exactly happened inside those 3 weeks? The gas attacks, the command decisions, the specific men whose names deserve to be said aloud. That is what the rest of this video walks through. If your eyes are already giving up on you, that is genuinely fine. Rest them. There is something quietly extraordinary about the idea of men fighting through a French forest in the summer of 1918. The smell of cordite and wheat dust in the air. Paris, 40 miles to the south, the whole outcome of the war balanced on a tree line. Let that image settle. The story is patient. It will be here when you're ready. This is the entire history of the Battle of Belleau Wood. There is a procurement ledger in the United States National Archives, a dry, bureaucratic document of the sort that historians usually skip past on their way to the more dramatic material. I didn't skip it. What it records is this. In 1917, the United States Marine Corps requisitioned 30,000 Springfield Model 1903 rifles to equip the men it was rushing to build into a fighting force. The number delivered was 18,437. That means 11,563 rifles simply did not exist when the men who needed them were supposed to have them. 11,000 gaps in the line, filled by improvisation, by borrowed weapons, by delay. That number, not any charge across a wheat field, is where the story of Belleau Wood actually begins. When the United States declared war on Germany on the 6th of April, 1917, the Marine Corps was not ready for what came next. No one was. The enlistment surge was immediate and enormous. More than 3,400 men signed up in April alone, roughly 4 times the monthly average, and most of them had never fired a weapon in their lives. The Marine Corps' great public identity, the one we're going to spend this entire series unpacking, was built on the reputation of the marksman, the rifleman, the disciplined shooter, the man who could hit a target at 500 yards before breakfast. That reputation was real, but it belonged to the Corps as it existed before April 1917. The Corps that shipped out to France was a different animal. It was larger, younger, and considerably less formed than the myth surrounding it. By the spring of 1918, the United States was managing to ship roughly 300,000 soldiers per month across the Atlantic, a logistical achievement genuinely without precedent in American military history, and one that the Germans had correctly identified as their primary strategic problem. If American forces arrived in sufficient numbers before the German army could deliver a knockout blow to Britain and France, Germany's window for victory would close permanently. This was the calculation behind what the Germans called their spring offensive. 4 massive attacks launched between March and July of 1918, designed to end the war before America's weight could be felt. The Americans were arriving at approximately 300,000 bodies per month, but they were arriving at roughly 654 tons of artillery shells per division per week. The British standard for the same period was approximately 1,900 tons. The Americans came with men and almost nothing else. The plan was to fill the gap with human beings. The Marines training in France between January and May of 1918 were doing so under French instructors, using French methods, in a system that had been designed for a kind of industrial-scale warfare that bore almost no resemblance to what those men had trained for back home. The French taught them gas defense, the small box respirator, the procedures for masking up in the dark, the discipline of never removing a mask until you were absolutely certain the contamination had cleared. They taught them trench construction, field fortification, and the brutal arithmetic of rolling barrage coordination. How to follow a curtain of falling shells closely enough to suppress the enemy, while remaining far enough back that you weren't killed by your own guns. One Marine private wrote home during this period. His letter survives in the collections of the Marine Corps History Division, saying simply, "They show us how to dig a hole, and then they show us how to die in it." He wasn't being dramatic, he was being accurate. The political structure of who owned these men, in a bureaucratic, institutional sense, was never fully resolved. The 4th Marine Brigade, which would fight at Belleau Wood, was attached to the United States 2nd Infantry Division and placed under the command of Brigadier General James Harbord, a United States Army officer, a Pershing loyalist, a man with no prior experience commanding Marines. This was not accidental. General John Pershing, commanding the entire American Expeditionary Force, had a complicated relationship with the Marine Corps throughout the war, and one of its earliest expressions was his decision to put an Army officer in charge of the Marine Brigade. Pershing was worried about the Corps operating as an independent identity within his force. The Marines had a press operation, a public image, and a tradition of institutional self-promotion that Pershing found, to put it diplomatically, inconvenient. So he gave them an army general. The consequences of that decision, tactical, political, and historical, run through every chapter of this story. The Springfield Model 1903 rifle, which was the standard weapon for every Marine who went to France, was chambered in .30 caliber .06 Springfield and was capable, in trained hands, of accurate aimed fire at distances exceeding 600 yards. This was significantly better than the German Karabiner 98 AZ carbine, which was optimized for the closer engagements that trench warfare typically produced. Marine marksmanship doctrine, as it existed before the war, emphasized slow and deliberate aimed fire at long range, the kind of shooting that took time, patience, and a steady hand. The doctrine was excellent. It would prove devastating in the open wheat fields approaching Belleau Wood. Inside the wood itself, where engagements happened at 10 yards or less in the dark between shattered trees, it was essentially useless. But that discovery was still weeks away. In the spring of 1918, the Marines were still the best riflemen in France. The question was whether that would be enough. On the 27th of May, 1918, the Germans launched Operation Blücher York, the third of their great spring offensives, against the French lines at Chemin des Dames. What followed was, by any measurable standard, catastrophic for the Allies. The German assault divisions tore a roughly 40-kilometer gap in the French front in under 6 hours, advancing faster in a single day than they had managed in 3 years of trench warfare. By the time the dust settled on the 27th of May, German forces had reached the north bank of the Marne River at Château-Thierry, roughly 95 kilometers from Paris. Paris, undefended. The Germans were closer to the capital of France than they had been at any point since 1914, and the French army, which had been fighting for 4 years and had buried more than 6 million of its sons in that time, was running out of the one thing no government can requisition: the will to keep going. General Philippe Pétain, the man who had held Verdun, the soldier that France trusted more than anyone alive in 1918, called on every Allied division he could reach. He called on British units. He called on American ones. He called specifically on the United States 2nd Division, which included the 4th Marine Brigade, and he sent it north toward the Marne with orders that left no room for interpretation. The phrase, as recorded in official orders, was essentially this: no retirement would be permitted on any pretext whatsoever. That order came down through the command chain to every Marine officer in the brigade. They were not being asked to be brave. They were being told, in writing, that retreat was operationally forbidden. The distinction matters. What we'll hear described in the next chapter as a spontaneous act of individual defiance was, at its root, a compliance with a written order, which doesn't make it less impressive, it just makes it more complicated. There is something worth sitting with before we go any further. The numbers I mentioned at the start, 18,437 rifles, delivered against a requisition of 30,000. Those numbers are not just a procurement shortfall. They are a metaphor for the entire American entry into the First World War. The United States came to France with enormous manpower, considerable optimism, and a structural deficit in almost everything else. Artillery shells, training time, tactical doctrine, and maps. Specifically, as we'll see in the next chapter, maps. The men who were about to fight at Belleau Wood were going to do so without a reliable map of the ground they were attacking. That detail, that single, almost unbelievable administrative failure, explains more about the casualties of June 1918 than any other single factor. The rifles that didn't arrive were a warning. Nobody read it. There is a document in the collections of the United States National Archives, Record Group 120, which is the AEF's operational records, that I keep returning to. It is an intelligence summary prepared by the 4th Brigade's Intelligence Section on the 5th of June 1918, one day before the opening assault on Belleau Wood. The document describes the wood as lightly held. 2 words, lightly held. Now, that document was prepared by American intelligence officers working from aerial observation, agent reports, and whatever could be gathered from the front lines. They were doing their jobs, and the information environment they were working in was genuinely poor. But here is the thing that doesn't get said clearly enough in most accounts of this battle. There was, at that same moment, a contradicting document. The German 461st Infantry Regiment's war diary, for approximately the same date, records that the regiment had, by the 5th of June, established interlocked machine gun positions at 23 points within the wood. 23 prepared positions, surveyed fields of fire, completed defensive lines. The gap between those two documents, lightly held on one side, 23 prepared machine gun positions on the other, is the gap that killed more than 1,000 men on the 6th of June, 1918. Belleau Wood, as it existed in the spring of 1918, was not a military installation. It was a private hunting preserve, owned by the de Givenchy family, roughly 200 acres of mixed forest, sitting on a bed of limestone boulders that had been deposited there during the last ice age. The pre-war French military maps of the area treat it as essentially empty space, walking paths, a hunting lodge in the northern section, the geological formations left unmarked because there was no military reason to mark them. When the German forces moved into the wood on the 1st of June, they discovered that the pre-existing landscape was almost ideally suited for defensive fortification. The limestone boulders created natural berms and firing positions that required almost no excavation. The dense underbrush provided concealment. The ravines and broken terrain broke up any attacking force's cohesion and eliminated the possibility of coordinated assault movements. The German engineers who moved into the wood in the first days of June didn't have to build a fortress. They just had to recognize that one already existed and arm it. On the night of the 4th of June, 1918, Lieutenant William A. Eddy, the intelligence officer for the 6th Marine Regiment, crawled through German lines with 2 enlisted men to gather direct reconnaissance of the wood. This was a genuinely dangerous mission, and Eddy carried it out with evident thoroughness. He came back with valuable information. The Germans were not holding the wood lightly. They were fortifying it. Machine gun positions were being established. Artillery was being registered on the approach routes. His report reached brigade headquarters. Brigadier General Harbord read it, and the attack order, which had already been written, which already specified the assault would commence the following afternoon, was not modified. I want to be careful here, because Harbord was not an incompetent man. He was under enormous pressure, operating within a French command structure that was insisting on immediate action, and there were legitimate arguments for proceeding despite imperfect intelligence. But there is a difference between proceeding despite incomplete intelligence and proceeding despite a specific warning that the intelligence picture is wrong. Eddie gave him the warning. The attack went forward. The assault was planned in 2 phases. Phase 1, at 03:45 on the 6th of June, would send the 1st Battalion, 5th Marines, Major Julius Turrell commanding, against Hill 142, a small elevation west of the wood that offered observation over the French division's left flank. Phase 2, at 1700 hours that same afternoon, would send 2 battalions, the 3rd Battalion, 5th Marines, under Major Benjamin Berry, and the 3rd Battalion, 6th Marines, under Major Burton Sibley, into the wood itself. The 2 phases were supposed to be sequential and supporting, with Hill 142 secured before the main assault went in. In the event, Phase 1 was a partial success, achieved at catastrophic cost. Phase 2 went forward on schedule, regardless of conditions, and the assault battalions entered the wood without reliable maps of its interior, without confirmed German positions, and, critically, without the artillery preparation that might have suppressed what was waiting for them inside. The French artillery support that Harbord had requested was not available in time. They went in without it. This is the administrative fact that explains everything that follows. The German defensive system inside Belleau Wood was not improvised opportunism. It was doctrine, carefully applied to favorable terrain. Each Maxim MG-08 position was sited so that its cone of fire overlapped with at least 2 adjacent positions, creating what German defensive doctrine called an interlocking field of fire, a zone in which moving targets could not find cover behind terrain features because they were being engaged simultaneously from multiple angles. Eliminating any one of those 23 positions didn't reduce the danger from the others. It simply removed one strand from a net that had 22 more. The system required pre-surveyed firing tables, carefully coordinated command, and positions prepared in advance, all of which the Germans had, and none of which the Marines had any knowledge of. The wood's own geology and history made it perfect for this kind of defense. The hunting paths that the de Givenchy family had built for leisure strolls now served as German communication routes. The boulders that had sat in that soil since the Ice Age were now gun platforms. Nobody planned any of this. It simply was. What happened on the afternoon of June 6, 1918, in the wheat fields south of Belleau Wood, is both exactly as dramatic as it has always been described, and considerably more complicated than any single account has fully captured. The Marines formed up in the open. There was no preliminary barrage. The French artillery had not been made available in time, and the decision was made to proceed. The men advanced in what their own training prescribed: disciplined lines, dressed properly, maintaining intervals. This was the formation that worked on a rifle range. It was the formation that the German MG-08 gunners, looking through their sights, saw coming across approximately 400 yards of open wheat. The MG-08 fired at a sustained rate of 400 rounds per minute. At that rate, across a front of advancing men in orderly rows, the mathematics were not in the Marines' favor. The attack began at 1700 hours. The casualty count had reached 31 officers and 1,056 enlisted men before nightfall. In a single afternoon, in the wheat. The second major assault, on the 10th of June, went better, but not because Harbord had fundamentally changed his approach. What had changed was the scale of artillery preparation. Beginning on the morning of the 9th of June, American and French batteries bombarded German positions in Belleau Wood for more than 24 hours, expending 28,075 mm rounds and 6,155mm shells. The bombardment turned the formerly attractive hunting preserve into what one Marine officer later described simply as a jungle of shattered trees. The rolling barrage that preceded the infantry assault on the morning of the 10th of June suppressed the German forward positions long enough for the 1st Marines to enter the wood. Progress was initially real. Then, within 90 minutes, the advance stalled again at the unneutralized northern positions. The system was damaged, not destroyed. Belleau Wood would be attacked 6 times in total before it was finally cleared. 6. Most people who know the story think it happened once. There is a specific moment from the fighting inside the wood, between the 10th and 15th of June, that I find genuinely difficult to process from a purely tactical standpoint. On the morning of the 11th of June, the 2nd Battalion, 5th Marines, Major Frederick Wise commanding, advanced through a thick morning mist toward the western face of the wood, supported by machine gun companies and elements of the 2nd Engineers. The battalion was supposed to attack north into the deeper sections of the wood, coordinating with Major Hughes' 1st Battalion pushing south. What actually happened was that Wise's battalion moved east across the wood's narrow waist, instead of north along its length. A navigational error caused, at least in part, by the unreliability of magnetic compasses in terrain containing significant iron deposits in the limestone subsoil. A 20-degree compass error over 400 yards of movement in dense forest produces a positional error of roughly 140 yards. The battalion hit the German southern defensive line, which was thinner and more depleted than the northern sector, and smashed through it. The breakthrough of Phase 2 was achieved by men who didn't know where they were going. Wise's memoir acknowledges the navigational error. His official after-action report describes the correct direction of movement. I have read both documents many times. I know what I think happened to the record between the battle and the filing date. By the 15th of June, both sides had consolidated what they held, and the battle had settled into a grinding interim phase. The Marines held the southern sections of the wood and Buresh's village. The Germans held the northern strongpoints. Between them was a landscape, if that word is permitted without the connotations I've banned from this script. A physical space of broken timber, upturned boulders, contaminated ground, and the particular silence that settles over positions where both sides have temporarily run out of the momentum to attack. The German 10th Division reinforced the northern positions. German artillery poured gas and high explosive onto Marine positions in the wood and in the surrounding fields, targeting the rotation schedules that German observers had apparently identified from signal intercepts. The Marines endured, the casualties mounted, and nobody on the Allied side had yet figured out how to solve the problem of 23 interlocking machine gun positions in 200 acres of rock-filled French forest. That solution was coming. It was going to cost more. There are 2 famous things said during the first days of June 1918 in the fields north of the Paris-Metz highway, and both of them have sourcing problems. One of them is attributed to a man who died before he could confirm it. The other was overheard by a man who was shot through the eye moments later. These are the foundations on which the public identity of the Marine Corps was largely constructed. And I mention this not to diminish what was said or done, but because the archive demands honesty about how thin the documentary ice sometimes is beneath the most celebrated moments in military history. The French army was retreating. This was not a disgrace. It was, in a certain terrible light, a rational response to an untenable situation. France had been fighting since August of 1914. By the spring of 1918, the French army had buried roughly 6 million of its soldiers, a figure so large it stops making human sense somewhere around the 2nd or 3rd time you try to comprehend it. The army that was moving south through the Marines' positions in the first days of June was not a broken force. It was an exhausted one, attempting to implement a doctrine of elastic defense that required reserves it no longer had. The French were supposed to absorb the German assault in forward positions, pull back to secondary lines, and counterattack from prepared rear positions. The problem, by the summer of 1918, was that France had almost no reserves capable of executing the counterattack phase. The doctrine had become a ritual of retreat without the mechanism that gave it meaning. Into this situation came the Americans, fresh, well supplied with men if not shells, and with no institutional memory of 4 years of this. On approximately the 1st of June 1918, a French officer, retreating south past Marine positions on or near the Paris-Metz highway, told the Marines they were in the path of an advance they could not stop and that they should pull back. The Marine Corps attributes the response to Captain Lloyd W. Williams, 2nd Battalion, 5th Marines. Retreat? Hell, we just got here. Those 5 words, or something very close to them, were spoken. Something was said. The problem is that Major Frederick Wise, Williams's own battalion commander, also claimed to have said those words. Both accounts appear in the source record. Williams was killed on the 11th of June, 9 days later, before he could confirm or deny the attribution. Wise survived the war and wrote a memoir. The Marine Corps chose Williams. I understand why they chose the dead man. A dead hero cannot complicate his own legend, cannot revise his account, cannot contradict the citation. But the historical record does not settle the question, and anyone who tells you it does isn't being straight with you. What the quote captured, whoever said it, was something real. The Marines had been explicitly ordered not to retire. Brigadier General Harbord, countermanding a French directive to prepare fallback positions to the south, had issued written orders telling the 4th Marine Brigade to hold where they stood. That order came from General Pétain himself, who understood something that no amount of tactical doctrine could paper over. If the Americans were seen retreating alongside the French, the political effect in Paris, in Washington, and in Berlin would be devastating. The French needed the Americans to be different, to demonstrate visibly and unambiguously that something new had entered the war. So Harbord put defiance on paper. He signed it. He distributed it to every battalion commander in the brigade. The spontaneous battlefield heroism of retreat? Hell, we just got here, was, at its administrative root, a compliance document. Between the 2nd and 5th of June, the Marines dug in north of the Paris-Metz highway and waited. German forces attacked the Marine positions on the 3rd, 4th, and 5th of June, attempting to push through to the road and continue south toward Paris. The Marines, fighting from shallow fighting positions they'd scratched into the limestone with bayonets, entrenching tools hadn't arrived in sufficient numbers, used their rifles in exactly the way their training prescribed. The Germans attacked across open ground with bayonets fixed. The Marines waited until the advancing soldiers were within roughly 100 yards and then opened fire with aimed, deliberate shots. The attacks broke. German regimental records for this period note, with evident surprise, unexpectedly heavy fire at long range. The Springfield 1903 at 400 yards against men in the open. It worked. The Wood at close quarters against men in prepared positions. That was a different problem entirely, and it was coming. The most important thing that happened between the 1st and 5th of June wasn't a firefight. It was an administrative act. On the night of the 4th of June, Lieutenant Eddy's patrol confirmed what German records already showed. The Wood was fortified. Harbord had the information. He had a warning, in writing, from his own intelligence officer. He also had a French Corps commander demanding action, a 4-brigade attack order already prepared, and a political situation in which American hesitation was not a viable option. I am not saying Harvard was wrong to attack. I am saying that when we talk about the courage of the men who walked into that wood on the 6th of June, we should also talk about the decision that put them there without a proper map, without confirmed enemy positions, and without the artillery preparation that the lessons of the previous 4 years had shown was non-negotiable before any assault on a prepared position. Bravery and command failure can coexist. They did here. The Marine marksmanship that stopped the German attacks of the 3rd through 5th of June was not mythological. It was the product of a genuine training doctrine and a genuine weapon. The Model 1903 fired a 30 caliber .06 round with a muzzle velocity of approximately 2,800 feet per second and was accurate in trained hands to 600 yards and beyond. German standard-issue carbines were not designed for that engagement distance. The Marines were fighting at ranges for which German doctrine had not fully prepared their infantry. In the open fields, before the wood, this mattered enormously. Inside the wood, where the MG08 could be brought to bear at 10 to 30 yards, the advantage evaporated. But we're still outside. We're still in the fields. The wood is waiting. On the evening of the 5th of June, Harvard issued his attack order. The assault on Hill 142 would go at 03:45 on the morning of the 6th. The assault on Belleau Wood itself would follow at 1700 hours that afternoon. No Marine battalion that was about to enter the wood had reconnaissance of its interior. The forest had been a private hunting preserve. Its trails and interior geography were known to the de Givenchy family and their gamekeepers, and to the German engineers who had spent 5 days turning it into a fortress. The Marines were going into 200 acres of boulder-strewn, machine gun-infested French woodland, with approximately the same geographical information they would have had from looking at it from the outside. The attack order was 4 pages long for the artillery component and half a page for the infantry component. I've read them both. The proportion tells you everything you need to know about where the thinking was and where it wasn't. Harvard, to his credit, recognized after the 6th of June that something fundamental had to change. He couldn't keep sending men across open ground and into an unsurveyed forest without preparation. The barrage of the 9th through 10th of June, 28,075 mm shells, 6,155 mm rounds, more than 1,800 metric tons of ordnance, delivered to a 200-acre forest in roughly 24 hours, was his written acknowledgement of that fact. He didn't put it in those terms. Generals rarely do. But when you read the Phase 2 attack order alongside the Phase 1 attack order, the difference is visible. One document has an artillery annex. The other didn't. People died in the space between those 2 documents. What Belleau Wood cost the Marine Corps in the first 9 days, before Phase 2 had even begun in earnest, was already more than the Corps had spent in any previous conflict in its history. Casualties from all American conflicts leading up to the First World War totaled roughly 800 men killed and wounded combined. The 6th of June alone produced 1,087 casualties. In one afternoon. In a wheat field in France. The institution that emerged from Belleau Wood was not the same institution that entered it. And understanding why requires understanding not just what the Marines did there, but what was done to them, what they were not told, and what the man who commanded them chose to do with the information he had. At 03:45 on the 6th of June 1918, in the grey pre-dawn darkness west of Belleau Wood, the 1st Battalion, 5th Marines, stepped off toward Hill 142 with 2 companies in the assault line and 2 that weren't yet in position. Major Julius Turrell, commanding the battalion, attacked anyway. He had no real choice. The French division on his left was already moving. The attack was coordinated, and waiting for his missing companies in the open before dawn was not a survivable option. What happened next was a story of improvisation, violence, and the particular kind of tactical success that can only be built from the wreckage of a plan that's already half broken. The men leading that assault, specifically Captain Hamilton's 49th Company and the remnants of the 67th Company after its commander was killed almost immediately, crossed open ground under fire from German positions on the hill and in the flanking tree lines. Marines were cut down in the approach. Officers died in the first minutes. The formation that had been so carefully ordered on the start line dissolved into something more fluid and more desperate within 500 yards of beginning. Hamilton, with his 49th Company, pushed from wood to wood across the slope of Hill 142, engaging entrenched German positions at close range, overrunning his assigned objective by roughly 6 yards before realizing he'd lost every junior officer in the company and the 67th had only one commissioned officer still standing. Hamilton reorganized both companies into a defensive position on the hill and held it. He didn't break through with tactical elegance. He arrived at the objective by surviving the approach. There is a detail in the official record of the Hill 142 fight that I find genuinely difficult to file under any standard historical category. Gunnery Sergeant Ernest A. Jansen, who was serving under the name Charles Hoffman, an alias he had apparently been using since enlistment, repelled a German counterattack against the newly taken hill by personally engaging 12 enemy soldiers, killing 2 with his bayonet before the others withdrew. For this action, he received the Medal of Honor. Actually, he received 2 Medals of Honor. The Navy version was awarded to Ernest A. Jansen. The Army version was awarded to Charles Hoffman. The same man, the same action, the same hill, processed twice through 2 separate bureaucratic systems because his alias created 2 separate service records. The first Medal of Honor in the Battle of Belleau Wood was awarded to a man whose name in the citation wasn't his name. I don't know what to do with that except note it and let it sit there as a piece of raw archival evidence about who went to war in 1918 and why some of them chose not to go as themselves. By mid-morning on the 6th of June, the 1st Battalion, 5th Marines, had secured Hill 142 at a cost of 9 officers and most of the battalion's 325 men. The flanks were exposed. Ammunition was nearly gone. The position was being held by exhausted men in improvised defensive positions who had been in continuous combat since before dawn. German counterattacks were still coming in. The French 167th Division's war diary records continued heavy fire from the Hill 142 sector well into the late morning, suggesting that what the Marine after-action report described as a secured position was still being actively contested for several hours after the declared time of capture. These 2 accounts, Marine secured versus French continued heavy fire, sit in the records side by side and do not resolve. The hill was taken. Whether it was fully controlled at the time Turrell reported it as such is a different question. The Phase 2 assault at 1700 hours that afternoon was the one that produced the numbers that still stop conversations. The 3rd Battalion, 5th Marines under Major Berry, and the 3rd Battalion, 6th Marines under Major Sibley, stepped off across the open wheat fields in the long shadow light of early evening. No preliminary barrage, no confirmed enemy positions. The French artillery had not been made available. Harbord ordered the assault forward regardless. The first waves of Marines advanced in exactly the kind of dressed, disciplined line that their training prescribed, and that looked, from a German machine gun position, like a gift. Major Berry was wounded in the forearm in the first minutes and continued commanding his battalion. Major Sibley's men swept into the southern end of the wood and encountered barbed wire, sharpshooters, and interlocked machine gun fire at close range. Men who had been walking upright across a wheat field were suddenly fighting hand-to-hand in a shattered forest. The transition took less than 5 minutes. During the initial step-off for the late afternoon assault, First Sergeant Dan Daly, already a two-time Medal of Honor recipient, already 44 years old, already a legend within the Corps before he ever set foot in France, was moving with the 73rd Machine Gun Company when the advance faltered. Men were dying around him. The line was stopping. The natural human response to heavy fire from a prepared position, when you are crossing open ground with no cover, is to go to ground and stay there. Daly didn't go to ground. What he said, and this is documented in the 6th Marines unit history and was reported by war correspondent Floyd Gibbons, before Gibbons was shot through the eye approximately 40 yards into the same field, was, "Come on, you sons of bitches. Do you want to live forever?" His men stood up. They went forward. That is what the archive shows. What the archive cannot show is the internal experience of a 44-year-old man who had already been awarded 2 Medals of Honor, who had already served in the Philippines and China and Haiti and Santo Domingo, who knew more about what machine gun fire did to advancing men than almost anyone in the field that afternoon, shouting those words across a wheat field in France. That part we don't get to know. Gibbons' dispatch, filed from wherever he managed to dictate or write it before his injuries overwhelmed him, reached the American military censors in Paris the following day. The censors had received word that Gibbons had been severely wounded, possibly fatally. The official account, preserved by the Carolina Museum of the Marine, states that the military censor, believing Gibbons to be dying or dead, concluded that it would be wrong to cut what he assumed were the last words of a fallen correspondent. He let the dispatch through uncensored. The dispatch named the United States Marines specifically, U.S. Marines, in print, in an American newspaper, for the first time in the war, and it described their assault at Belleau Wood in terms that produced, within days, the kind of public response that changes how a nation understands its own military. Gibbons was alive. He survived the war and lost only the eye. The entire public identity of the Marine Corps at Belleau Wood, the legend that we are spending this series examining, was born from a censor's decision, based on a false assumption about a living man he thought was dead. Truth in wartime is rarely where you expect to find it. The casualty figure for the 6th of June, 1918, 31 officers and 1,056 enlisted Marines, was the highest single-day casualty count in Marine Corps history up to that point, exceeding the total killed and wounded from every conflict the Corps had been involved in since its founding in 1775, in a single afternoon. This is not said to produce a particular emotional response. It's said because the number forces a question that the heroic narrative of Belleau Wood usually prefers not to ask directly. At what point does the bravery of the men who advanced across that wheat field exist in uncomfortable proximity to the decisions of the men who ordered them to do it without adequate preparation? The Marines who crossed that field were not ignorant of the danger. Some of them had been in France long enough to understand what machine gun fire did to men in the open. They went anyway. That is the thing that deserves the closest examination, not the charge itself, but the conditions under which the charge was ordered. Belleau Wood was not a forest that happened to contain German soldiers. It was a fortress that happened to be made of trees. And understanding this distinction, understanding it in the specific, technical, almost architectural sense, is the only way to understand why the Marines had to attack it 6 times before it fell. The pre-war landscape of the wood had been shaped by 2 forces, geological time and bourgeois recreation. The limestone boulders that filled the forest floor had been deposited during the last glacial period, and had sat in that configuration, essentially unchanged, for roughly 10,000 years. The de Givenchy family, who owned the preserve, had built walking paths around them and a hunting lodge in the northern section for their own use. None of this appeared on military maps, because there was no military reason it should. When German forces moved into the wood on the 1st of June, 1918, what they found was a pre-engineered defensive system that required only the intelligence to recognize it and the resources to arm it. The boulders were gun platforms, the ravines were communication trenches, the dense underbrush was concealment. The German engineers who spent the first 5 days of June in that forest didn't build a fortress. They commissioned one that nature had been constructing for 10,000 years. The MG-08 Maxim, which was the primary weapon in 23 of the wood's defensive positions, was a water-cooled, belt-fed machine gun, firing 7.92mm Mauser rounds at a sustained rate of 400 rounds per minute, with a practical effective range of roughly 2,000 meters. It was heavy. The weapon itself weighed over 60 kilograms on its Schlitten sled mount, and it was not portable in any meaningful sense. This was, by design, a fixed defensive weapon. It was not intended to move. It was intended to be placed in a prepared position, with surveyed firing tables, and to fire along pre-calculated arcs until it ran out of ammunition or the position was physically overrun. Each position required 2 operators, a loader, and a water source for the cooling jacket. Each gun consumed approximately 1 liter of water per 250 rounds. The positions in Belleau wood, built into and between the limestone boulders, had prepared water supplies. The Germans had thought about this. The interlocking field of fire principle, what German defensive doctrine called Überwachung, or mutual covering fire, meant that eliminating any single position in the wood didn't meaningfully reduce the danger from the others. Each position was sighted so that its cone of fire overlapped with at least 2 neighbors. An attacker who found cover from one gun was exposed to 2 more. This was not improvised on the ground by individual gun crews. It was designed from a central plan, with surveyed firing tables, coordinated by a defensive engineering staff who spent 5 days in the wood before the 1st Marine crossed the wheat field on the 6th of June. The Americans attacking the wood had no knowledge of this plan. They had lightly held, in their intelligence summary, and the experience of the open ground battles from the 1st through the 5th of June, where German forces had attacked them in the open and been cut down by rifle fire. They were about to discover that the Germans inside the wood had prepared for a completely different kind of fight. The gas campaigns of mid-June are perhaps the least discussed element of the Belleau Wood battle in popular accounts, and they were among the most consequential. German artillery struck Marine positions in and around the wood on multiple occasions between the 10th and 15th of June, with a mixture of what German doctrine called Grünkreuz, Green Cross, primarily phosgene, and Gelbkreuz, Yellow Cross, primarily mustard gas. Phosgene was the immediate killer. Colorless, smelling faintly of freshly cut hay, it bound to hemoglobin in the lungs and prevented oxygen transfer, producing death from asphyxiation within hours of significant exposure. Mustard gas operated on an entirely different timeline. It was not primarily a kill agent at the concentrations used at Belleau Wood. It was a denial agent. Dichlorodiethyl sulfide, mustard gas, has a vapor pressure low enough that it doesn't evaporate quickly at normal June temperatures. It settles into low ground, soaks into soil and clothing and leather, and contaminates everything it touches for days. A Marine who walked through a mustard-contaminated patch of ground and then sat down in a shell hole would contaminate himself, his equipment, and anyone he subsequently helped or carried. The gas mask protected the respiratory system and eyes. It did not protect the skin in the armpits, the groin, the backs of the knees, the soft skin around the eyelids. Men developed blistering in those areas 4 to 6 hours after exposure, often long after they thought they'd escaped the attack. By then, they'd passed the contamination to others. The gas attack of the 13th of June deserves particular attention because it produced one of the most documented individual acts in the battle. It began in the early hours of the morning. The precise timing varies slightly between the official Marine Corps citation, which says the night of June 13th, and the personal account given by the man who survived because of it, which places the decisive moment in the early morning of the 14th. In the gas-filled sections of the wood, Gunnery Sergeant Fred W. Stockham of the 96th Company, 6th Marines, discovered that a wounded Marine near him had a damaged gas mask, the seal broken, the canister compromised, the filtration system unable to protect against the contamination settling through the trees. Stockham removed his own mask and gave it to the man. He then continued moving through the contaminated area, directing the evacuation of casualties without any respiratory protection for an extended period. He was evacuated on the 14th. He died on the 22nd of June from the effects of mustard gas exposure. He was 36 years old. He received the Medal of Honor posthumously. The man whose life Stockham saved was Marine Barack T. Mattingly. Mattingly lived to old age and gave an oral history interview in the 1930s, describing the moment the mask was given to him, describing Stockham's face without the mask, describing the sound of Stockham's breathing as the contamination took hold. That interview sits in the archive and is almost never cited in the accounts that reference Stockham's Medal of Honor citation. I have read descriptions of Stockham's blood-stained gas mask, which is held in the collection of the National Museum of the Marine Corps in Triangle, Virginia. The blood on it is documented. Whose blood it is, Stockham's or Mattingly's or someone else's from that night in the wood, is not documented. Both men were in the same contaminated forest. Both men were handling casualties. The mask passed between them during a night that neither man would have fully clear in his memory when the sun came up. Captured German regimental documents from the Belleau Wood fighting describe the American attackers in terms that are both respectful and, in places, bewildered. A German private from a company that had been reduced from 120 men to 30 wrote in a captured diary, "We have Americans opposite us who are terribly reckless fellows." An officer's report from the German 28th Division, written during the Phase II fighting, describes Marine attacks as conducted with vigorous, self-confident aggression that continued even after the attacking formations had suffered losses that would have halted most European units. These are enemy assessments, written in the middle of combat, with no reason to flatter. They are more valuable as evidence of what the Marines were actually like on the ground than almost any American source from the same period, precisely because they come from people who had every reason to be honest about the threat they were facing. The wood was also, by mid-June, a navigational problem of a specific and technical kind. The limestone subsoil of the Belleau Wood area contains significant iron mineral deposits, which caused magnetic compass readings to deviate unpredictably by up to 25 degrees from true magnetic north. In a dense forest, in morning mist or darkness, a 20-degree navigation error over 400 yards of movement produces a positional error of approximately 140 yards, enough to send an entire battalion into the wrong sector without anyone realizing it until they were already engaged. This is precisely what happened to Wise's 2nd Battalion, 5th Marines, on the morning of the 11th of June. It is also, incidentally, a problem that GPS navigation has made essentially impossible to replicate, which is one reason modern readers sometimes find it hard to take seriously. In 1918, in a forest in France, with a compass that the geology was lying to, it was not a trivial problem. It was the kind of problem that got people killed, and, in this particular case, accidentally got people through a defensive line that a correctly navigated attack might not have penetrated. The physical reality of what the wood looked like by mid-June, after the barrage of the 9th through 10th, after 2 weeks of fighting, after the gas attacks and the artillery exchanges and the accumulated damage of 600,000 pounds of ordnance delivered to 200 acres, was not what it had been when the Germans moved in on the 1st of June. The trees were shattered. The undergrowth was torn open. The walking paths of the de Givenchy family were buried under debris. The hunting lodge in the northern section had changed hands multiple times and had been reduced by artillery to its foundation stones. And yet the northern machine gun positions, the ones that had survived the barrage of the 9th because they were built into limestone boulders that the 75mm guns couldn't fully penetrate, were still operational, still firing. The forest, as a physical object, was gone. The defensive system it had housed was not. That distinction between destroying the landscape and destroying the weapon is the one that the final assault of the 25th and 26th of June would have to resolve. Two cemeteries stand within walking distance of each other at Belleau Wood. The American one, the Ain Marne American Cemetery, maintained by the American Battle Monuments Commission, holds 2,289 graves marked with white crosses and stars of David, and carries on the wall of its memorial chapel the names of 1,060 men whose bodies were never recovered. The German one, established in March 1922 by the Volksbund Deutscher Kriegsgräberfürsorge, holds 8,625 men. Of those, 4,321 rest in a common grave. 3,847 of them are unidentified. Almost half the Germans who died fighting the Marines were buried without names. The nickname, Devil Dogs, has a documented origin story, or at least, it has an origin story. The men it was allegedly used to describe, on the other side of the wire, mostly don't have names at all. The Marine Corps University's own research paper on the Devil Dog legend, an internal document produced by the institution's history division, contains a sentence that I have read more times than I can count, and that I think deserves to be read aloud in any honest treatment of this subject. It states, plainly and without dramatic emphasis, that the term Teufelshunde was not commonly known in contemporary German, and that the closest common German term would be Höllenhunde, which translates as hellhound, not devil dog. This is not a minor academic footnote. This is the Marine Corps' own historians acknowledging that the German word that supposedly gave the Marines their most famous nickname is not a word that German soldiers would naturally have used. The institution that benefits most from the legend produced the research that most directly undermines it, and then continued to use the legend. German communications from the Belleau Wood fighting that have been examined by historians, captured documents, post-battle assessments, regimental reports, describe the Marines in consistent and specific terms. Vigorous, reckless, accurate with their rifles, willing to continue attacking after losses that would have halted other units. Lieutenant Colonel Ernst Otto, writing from the German Army's historical section in 1928, 10 years after the battle, specifically about Marine Corps performance, described their fiery advance and great tenacity as qualities well recognized by their opponents. Otto was writing a formal professional assessment of an enemy force. He had every reason to use whatever terminology had been current among German soldiers at the time. He did not use Teufelshunde. Neither, in the contemporaneous documents that have been examined, did the soldiers who actually faced the Marines in the wood. The earliest confirmed appearance of the term Teufelhunden in connection with the Marines at Belleau Wood is in an American recruitment poster produced approximately 6 weeks after the battle ended. The poster shows a Marine Corps bulldog facing down a German dachshund. It was produced by the Marine Corps' own publicity apparatus. This does not prove that no German soldier ever used the phrase. Absence of evidence is not, by itself, evidence of absence, and the archive of German field communications from June 1918 is not complete. But the pattern is troubling. The term appears in American newspapers, in American publicity materials, and in American institutional history. It does not appear in the captured German documents, in the formal German military assessments, or in the account of the most prominent German military historian who wrote specifically about the Marines. The most parsimonious explanation for this pattern is that devil dogs is an American construction, attributed retrospectively to German soldiers who were afraid, because the story of being named by the enemy is always more powerful than the story of naming yourself. What the Marines actually were at Belleau Wood, what the German documents confirm, independently and without institutional motive, is both more complicated and more interesting than the nickname suggests. They were accurate riflemen in open terrain who were stopped by prepared machine gun positions in enclosed terrain. They were determined attackers who required 6 assaults to clear a 200-acre forest. They were men fighting under a command structure they didn't control, with intelligence they'd been told was adequate and wasn't, against a defensive system whose sophistication they hadn't been warned about. They adapted, eventually. The Phase 3 assault of the 25th through 26th of June, which finally cleared the wood, used the combined arms approach that the June 6th failure had proved was non-negotiable. They learned. The learning cost more than 4,000 casualties in 26 days. But they learned. The naming question is not, ultimately, about the word. It's about what institutions do with their defining moments. Every fighting force that has ever existed constructs the story of itself from the events it chooses to remember and the terms it chooses to use. The Marine Corps chose Belleau Wood as its founding myth of modern warfare, the moment when the Corps became something different from what it had been. The choice is understandable. The battle was genuinely consequential, the fighting genuinely fierce, the casualties genuinely staggering, the outcome genuinely important. All of that is true. What is also true is that somewhere between the wheat field and the recruitment poster, a German word entered the story that may never have been spoken by a German soldier, and that the institution most invested in the word's authenticity produced the research that most clearly questions it. Both of those things are in the archive. Both of them are part of what Belleau Wood actually was. The wood itself, the physical 200 acres, still gives up its evidence on a schedule set by corrosion rates and drainage patterns rather than human convenience. In 2023, French ordnance disposal teams operating in the Belleau Wood sector recovered 147 items of unexploded ordnance, including 4 artillery shells classified as containing potential chemical agent residue. 105 years after the barrage of the 9th and 10th of June, 1918, the ground was still returning what had been put into it. The battle, in the most literal physical sense, is not finished. The legend is fully formed, polished, institutionalized, and distributed in 16 countries via Marine Corps recruiting materials. The shells are still in the ground. History rarely resolves in the order we prefer. There is a village called Bourèche that almost nobody mentions when they tell the story of Belleau Wood. It sits roughly 1 kilometer southeast of the wood itself, a small cluster of French farm buildings and streets that, in the summer of 1918, occupied a position of extraordinary tactical importance. Whoever held Bourèche controlled the eastern approach to the wood. Whoever held the eastern approach could either funnel German reinforcements into the wood's defenders or cut them off entirely. The village was, in the simplest possible military terms, the key to the lock. And on the evening of the 6th of June, 1918, it was taken and held by fewer than 25 Marines, who had no one on their flanks, no artillery support, and Germans on 3 sides. The assault on Bourèche was conducted simultaneously with the main attack on Belleau Wood, as part of the afternoon Phase 2 operation. The 96th Company of the 2nd Battalion, 6th Marines, under the command of a lieutenant named Clifton B. Cates, was given the objective. Cates was 23 years old. He had graduated from the University of Tennessee. He'd been commissioned as a Marine officer, and he was about to hold a French village through one of the longest nights of the war, with a force that diminished by the hour. The 96th Company went into the assault with roughly 225 men. It crossed open ground under fire, entered the village streets, and engaged the German defenders in the kind of close-quarters fighting that the Wheatfield approach had made no provision for. By the time Buresh was taken, the company had lost more than half its strength. The survivors were in a village on three sides of which German forces were reorganizing. Kate sent a message back to battalion headquarters. It was written on whatever paper was available, carried by runner across ground under German observation, and it arrived at headquarters sometime that evening. The message has been preserved, and it reads in a way that is worth quoting exactly, because no reconstruction could improve on it. Cates wrote, "I am in Buresh, with only 2 men and 22 replacements. We drove the Boche out of the town. We have suffered many casualties. Can you send us support? I have no one on my flanks, and the enemy are on 3 sides of me. There is nothing between us and the Boche." Read that again. 2 men and 22 replacements. No flanks. Germans on 3 sides. And in the middle of this operational catastrophe, a 23-year-old lieutenant is still reporting his position clearly, still using the correct military format, still asking for support rather than permission to withdraw. The message is not heroic in any performed sense. It is the message of a man who is doing his job in conditions his job was never designed for. The 4th Brigade War Diary records Buresh as secured by approximately 2200 hours on the 6th of June. Kate's message, which the timing of the runner's journey almost certainly places after that hour, describes a situation that is emphatically not secured. Brigade headquarters declared a tactical success that the man holding the village was not experiencing. This is a sourcing conflict of a very specific kind. It's not that the two accounts describe different events. It's that they describe the same event from positions of such different information that they might as well be describing different battles. Harbord's headquarters knew Buresh was taken. Kate's knew Buresh was barely held. Both things were true simultaneously, and the gap between them is the gap between tactical reporting and tactical reality that recurs throughout this battle like a recurring fault line in the documentary record. What saved Buresh? What kept those 20-odd Marines in possession of a village on 3 sides of which a German army was reorganizing was partly the exhaustion of German forces who had already absorbed significant casualties, and partly the arrival of reinforcements through the night that brought the garrison to a more sustainable strength. The village then transformed, over the following days, from a contested objective into a forward operating base, a position from which the entire eastern approach to Belleau Wood could be observed, and from which Harbord could, and eventually did, position weapons to fire into the wood from the flank. Specifically, 12 Browning M1917 machine guns were eventually emplaced in Buresh, positioned to sweep the eastern face of the wood and cut the German reinforcement corridor that the 10th Division had been using. Those 12 guns, sitting in a village that Cates held with 24 men through one of the worst nights of the battle, became the decisive flanking element of the Phase II assault. They were the reason the wood could eventually be suppressed from 2 directions simultaneously. Without Buresh, the geometry of the Phase II attack doesn't work. Without Cates, Buresh doesn't hold. The Browning M1917 was the first American-designed heavy machine gun to see large-scale combat use, and its deployment at Buresh represents something technically significant. It was water-cooled, like the German Maxim, and fired at between 450 and 600 rounds per minute, a rate comparable to the German weapon, but achieved through an entirely different operating mechanism. Where the Maxim used a toggle lock operated by recoil energy, the Browning used a short recoil, sliding block system that proved, in the field, somewhat more tolerant of the kind of sustained fire conditions that Belleau Wood demanded. Positioned on the eastern edge of Buresh, these guns could engage targets at ranges of up to 2,000 meters across the open ground between the village and the wood's eastern face. The German reinforcement parties moving between their rear areas and the wood's northern sector had no cover on that ground. The 12 guns in Buresh turned the eastern approach into a denial zone that the Germans had not anticipated when they designed their defensive system. There is an irony here that I find genuinely difficult to ignore. The 12 machine guns that arguably did more to determine the outcome of Phase 2 than any single infantry action were emplaced in a village whose tactical importance was almost completely dependent on a 23-year-old lieutenant holding it through the night with 24 men. If Cates had withdrawn, if he had read his situation accurately as untenable and pulled the company back to the Marine lines, those guns never get placed. The geometry of the Phase 2 assault doesn't work, and the battle that is remembered as a Marine Corps triumph might have had a very different ending. Nobody planned the connection between Cates's desperate night in Buresh and the 12 guns that fired into the wood 6 days later. It emerged from the accumulated consequences of individual decisions made in conditions no plan had anticipated. This is what military history actually looks like when you get close enough to it. Not inevitability, contingency, everything hanging on everything else. Clifton B. Cates went on to command the 4th Marine Division at Iwo Jima and to serve as the 19th Commandant of the Marine Corps from 1948 to 1951. The decisions he made about Marine Corps structure and doctrine during his tenure as Commandant were made by a man who had personally experienced what happened when infantry was committed without adequate preparation, without confirmed flanks, and without support, because he had spent one of the longest nights of the First World War sitting in a commandeered French building in Buresh with 2 men and 22 replacements. Whether his Belleau Wood experience made him a more cautious or more aggressive commander in the Second World War is something his papers address obliquely rather than directly. What's not oblique is the fact that the young officer who sent that message, precise, clear, honest about his situation, still asking for support rather than permission to quit, was already showing the qualities that eventually put him in command of a division at one of the most costly battles of the Pacific War. The most significant thing about Buresh in the broader story of Belleau Wood is also the thing that is most consistently absent from popular accounts of the battle. The standard narrative of Belleau Wood is the narrative of men crossing a wheat field and fighting in a forest. It is a vertical narrative: attack, resistance, attrition, breakthrough. Buresh introduces a horizontal dimension that the vertical narrative doesn't accommodate. The village didn't fall in front of the Marines. It fell beside them. Its tactical function wasn't to provide a path forward, but to provide a platform from which the forward fight could be supported. The history of Belleau Wood has been written, with very few exceptions, by people who were interested in what happened inside the wood. Buresh was outside the wood, so it gets left out. And when it gets left out, the geometry of the battle becomes impossible to fully understand, because you're missing the piece that made the flanking fires possible, and the flanking fires are the piece that made the final outcome possible. History, like military operations, is a 3-dimensional problem. The accounts we have inherited are mostly 2-dimensional. There is a collection of personal letters held in the archives of the Marine Corps History Division that doesn't get cited very often in the tactical and operational accounts of Belleau Wood. And I understand why. Letters don't fit neatly into the chronology of phases and objectives that military history prefers. But the letters are the only place in the entire documentary record where the men who fought in that wood speak directly, in their own voices, about what they saw and what they understood and what they thought was happening to them. They are not heroic documents. They are not tragic documents. They are honest documents, which is rarer and more valuable than either. One letter, written approximately 2 days before the 6th of June assault, by a Marine whose name I will not use without confirmed authorization from the archive, contains a sentence that has stayed with me since I first read it. The letter says, "We are going to do something very soon. I don't know what it is yet, but they are giving us extra ammunition. That's all. No drama, no premonition. Just a young man noticing that the ammunition issue has changed and drawing the correct conclusion. He died on the 6th of June, 1918. The letter survived him by roughly 108 years. It's in a box in a climate-controlled archive in Quantico, Virginia, and it is, in its quiet precision, one of the most accurate documents produced by the entire battle. Because he was right. They were going to do something very soon. He didn't get to find out what it cost. The letters from the period between the 1st and 5th of June describe, with a consistency that is itself documentary evidence, the sight of French civilians moving south through the Marine positions. Refugees. People pushing handcarts loaded with whatever they could carry. Mattresses. Photograph albums. Food for animals that were tied to the back of the carts and didn't understand why they were moving. Several of the letter writers described the same specific image independently. An old French farmer who refused to leave his field. None of them explain why this image struck them so forcefully. All of them mention it. There is something in that repetition. The same man in the same field, appearing in multiple letters written by men who didn't know each other, that functions as an inadvertent primary source on what mattered to people at the edge of catastrophe. Not the military situation, not the orders. An old man who wouldn't move. The death telegram was the other primary document produced by Belleau Wood in quantity, and it was a document of a completely different kind. The War Department form was standard, a brief notification in bureaucratic language addressed to next of kin, informing them that their son or husband or brother had been killed in action or had died of wounds. Regret to inform you. Those were the words at the top, and everything that followed was a matter of filling in the relevant fields. Name, rank, unit, date, general location. No details. No context. No explanation of what the ground looked like, or what the objective was, or whether the thing that was attempted was worth the cost. Just the administrative fact of the death, transmitted through the postal service, arriving in a kitchen or a parlor in Ohio or Georgia or California, weeks after the man described in it had already been buried in France. The gap between the event and its notification, sometimes 3 weeks, sometimes longer, meant that families were often still receiving letters from their sons when the death telegram arrived. The last letter and the telegram in the same week's mail, that is what the administrative structure of death in 1918 actually produced. Gunnery Sergeant Fred W. Stockham was 36 years old in June of 1918. He had been a Marine long enough to have known the Corps before the war, long enough to have built the kind of institutional identity that the older enlisted men carried as a kind of professional weight. He was part of the 96th Company, the same company that Cates led into Buresh on the evening of the 6th. By the 13th of June, the company was deep in the fighting inside and around the wood. The gas attacks that began in the early morning hours of that date used a mixture of phosgene and mustard, immediate respiratory danger and delayed dermal contamination simultaneously, a combination designed to overwhelm both the mask and the skin in succession. Marines who masked up quickly might avoid the phosgene. They couldn't avoid the mustard if they stayed in the contaminated area long enough. Stockham found a wounded Marine whose gas mask had been damaged, the seal broken, the canister compromised. The Marine Corps citation for his Medal of Honor states that Stockham removed his own mask and gave it to the wounded man. The witness account given by Barak T. Mattingly, the Marine who received the mask, describes the moment in terms that are more specific and more human than any citation could be. Mattingly described Stockham's face without the mask. He described the sound of Stockham's breathing in the contaminated air. He described Stockham continuing to move through the gas-filled section of the wood, directing the evacuation of other casualties without any protection for a period of time that neither man could measure precisely, but that both understood was too long. Stockham was evacuated on the 14th of June. He died on the 22nd, 8 days later, from the effects of mustard gas exposure. The Medal of Honor citation notes the date as the night of June 13th. Mattingly's account, given in the 1930s, places the decisive moment in the early morning of the 14th. The discrepancy is small. The difference between a single act of sacrifice and a prolonged night of it is not. Stockham's blood-stained gas mask is in the collection of the National Museum of the Marine Corps. It is documented, photographed, catalogued. The blood on it has never been identified as belonging to any specific individual because the forensic means to do so didn't exist when the artifact was acquired, and the institutional will to do so hasn't been sufficient since. It could be Stockham's. It could be Mattingly's. It could be from one of the other casualties Stockham was handling in the contaminated wood before he was evacuated. The mask is the most personal artifact of the most personal act in the entire Belleau wood battle, and it sits in a case with a label that tells you what it is, without telling you whose blood it carries. I have thought about that quite a lot, and I don't have a satisfying conclusion. Some things in the archive resist resolution, and trying to force one onto them does more damage than admitting that the uncertainty is real. Of the 616 Marines killed in action at Belleau Wood, 334 died not of the wounds that put them out of the fight, but of those wounds over the subsequent hours and days. They survived the initial injury, survived to be evacuated, received treatment at aid stations and field hospitals, and died anyway. Of infection, of gas exposure that continued to damage tissue after the source was removed, of secondary pneumonia that developed in blistered lung tissue weeks after the original attack. These 334 deaths are counted in the casualty total. They're listed in the records, but they occupy a different category in the historical imagination than the men who died in the wheat field on the 6th of June. And that distinction, the dramatic death versus the slow one, is a distortion that the archive doesn't create, but that the history built on top of it often reflects. Stockham is in neither category. He died in a hospital 9 days after giving away the thing that was keeping him alive. His death is documented with considerable precision. What it cost him, in the hours between the wood and the hospital, is not. The Navy corpsmen and medical officers who worked the casualty collection points during the gas attacks of June, specifically around the 13th through the 15th, are the least documented group of people in the entire Belleau Wood narrative. Their professional records exist, individual citations exist, but the texture of what they experienced, treating men whose injuries were invisible for the first 12 hours, watching blistering develop in places that clothing had covered, handling casualties who believed they had escaped exposure but hadn't, is preserved only in fragments. The Navy Medical Corps records for the AEF show that between the 15th and 30th of June, a period that encompasses the immediate aftermath of the gas campaigns, 12,030 gas casualties were recorded across the AEF, of which the Marine sector contributed a disproportionate share. The Medical Corps records are precise about numbers and imprecise about individuals, which is the opposite of what we usually want from a documentary source. The numbers show the scale, the individuals show the cost. In the Belleau Wood archive, we have both, and they don't always point at the same story. On the 9th of June, 1918, Brigadier General James Harbord sat in the 4th Brigade headquarters and wrote an artillery preparation order that was, by the standards of the documents he had produced in the previous week, extraordinary in its specificity. It listed battery positions. It specified registration targets by grid reference. It established time-on-target protocols that coordinated the fire of multiple calibers against specific defensive sectors. It had an annex, 4 pages. The attack order for the 6th of June, the one that sent the Marines across the wheat field without a preliminary barrage, without confirmed enemy positions, without a map of the wood, was half a page. I have read both documents. The difference in length is not a bureaucratic coincidence. It is the record of a man who understood, by the 9th of June, what he had not fully understood a week earlier. Harbord was not, by any reasonable assessment, a simple figure. He was a graduate of Kansas State Agricultural College, a cavalryman by training, an officer who had built his career in the institutional structure of the pre-war army through a combination of genuine intelligence and the kind of political skill that Pershing valued in his closest associates. He had no prior Marine experience. He had been placed in command of the 4th Marine Brigade, specifically because Pershing wanted an army officer in that role, and he had spent the first days of June learning a kind of warfare, close-terrain infantry combat against prepared positions, that his cavalry background had not prepared him for. The 6th of June was the learning experience. The 9th of June was the corrective. The problem was that the corrective cost more lives to implement than it should have, because the thing being corrected was a decision that shouldn't have been made in the first place. The barrage of the 9th through the morning of the 10th of June was, by any reasonable measure, impressive. 28,000 rounds of 75mm ammunition and 6,000 rounds of 155mm. That is a combined weight of roughly 1,847 metric tons of ordnance delivered to a 200-acre forest in approximately 24 hours. The math works out to approximately 9.2 tons of high explosive per acre of forest. The wood, which had been described in pre-war accounts as a pleasant hunting preserve of mature timber and comfortable underbrush, was photographically documented after the barrage as a landscape of shattered trunks and upturned limestone. The hunting lodge in the northern section, which had changed hands several times already, was reduced to its stone foundation. The walking paths were buried. The undergrowth was gone. What replaced the forest was what soldiers called a jungle, not in the tropical sense, but in the sense of broken, tangled, impassable vegetation that had been turned by explosive force into an obstacle rather than a landscape. The 75mm MLE 1897 field gun, the French 75, one of the genuinely iconic weapons of the First World War, fired a fixed round with an independent percussion fuse at a sustained rate of 15 rounds per minute in rapid fire. Its flat trajectory, which made it the ideal weapon for direct fire against surface positions and trench lines, was also its limitation. It couldn't reach targets that were protected by reverse slopes or deeply embanked behind earth and stone. The 155mm howitzer, firing at higher elevation angles, could reach those targets. The combination of the two, 75mm for surface suppression and 155mm for deep position destruction, is the combined fire system that Harbord was, under fire and under pressure, learning to use. It wasn't new doctrine. The French and British had been doing versions of this for 4 years. Harbord was catching up. The Marines were paying the tuition. The assault of the morning of the 10th of June went into the wood at 0430 hours, behind a rolling barrage, a tir roulant, moving forward at a preset rate ahead of the advancing infantry, close enough to suppress the enemy, far enough that the Marines weren't being killed by their own guns. The 1st Battalion, 6th Marines, under Major Hughes, pushed north into the wood in the wake of the barrage. Initial progress was faster than the 6th of June. The direct fire positions of the German forward line had been suppressed, and the Marines entered the wood without immediately encountering the weight of fire that had shattered the Phase 1 assault. But within 90 minutes, the advance stalled. The northern machine gun positions, the ones built into the limestone boulders, the ones the 155mm rounds had impacted but not destroyed, were still operational. Major Cole, commanding the 6th Machine Gun Battalion, was mortally wounded. Captain Harlan Major, the senior captain present, assumed command. The Phase 2 assault achieved real gains and real momentum before stopping at the same place that had stopped everything else, the northern defensive sector of Belleau Wood, where the Germans had put their heaviest positions in the hardest terrain. Harbord's response to the stall was to commit Wise's 2nd Battalion, 5th Marines, to a secondary attack from the western face of the wood, creating a two-axis assault that the Phase 2 plan hadn't originally specified. The order reached Wise, and on the morning of the 11th of June, his battalion moved forward in morning mist that was thick enough to eliminate visual landmarks and unreliable enough compasses to make navigation genuinely problematic. What happened next has been covered in this series already. The navigational error, the accidental engagement of the southern defensive line, the breakthrough that wasn't planned and couldn't have been. But what matters in the context of Harbord's tactical evolution is this. The decision to commit a 2nd Battalion in a second axis of advance, made in response to a stall in the primary advance, is exactly the kind of adaptive command decision that the 6th of June didn't include. Harbord was learning. The lessons were arriving at approximately the same rate as the casualties. I find Harbord's memoir, The American Army in France, 1917 to 1919, published in 1936, genuinely difficult to read straightforwardly. It is a well-written book by an intelligent man who is also a man constructing his own legacy, and those two things are sometimes in productive tension and sometimes not. His description of the Phase 2 assault credits the artillery preparation with breaking the German defense. The German 28th Division's war diary, which was captured after the battle and is available in translation, does not describe a broken defense. It describes a defense that was damaged, degraded, and eventually outweighed, but that maintained organized resistance in the northern sector through the entire Phase 2 period. The barrage worked. It didn't work as completely as Harbord's account suggests. Phase 2 achieved real gains, and then stalled at the same northern positions it had been stalling at since the 10th. The southern breakthrough of Wise's battalion was an accident. The northern sector required another full round of preparation and assault before it finally fell. Harbord's memoir describes a progressive victory. The German record describes a progressive withdrawal under pressure from positions that were eventually untenable but never truly broken. The 2nd Engineers, both battalions, fought alongside the Marine regiments throughout the Belleau Wood campaign in a capacity that their engineering designation does not adequately describe. They dug trenches and repaired roads at night and fought as infantry during the day, a dual role that produced a comment from a Marine captain recorded in John Thomason's account. "Boy, they dig trenches and mend roads all night, and they fight all day." This is not documented in the after-action reports with the same precision as the Marine infantry actions, partly because the engineers were attached, rather than organic, to the brigade, and partly because the Marine institutional memory of Belleau Wood has, for understandable reasons, prioritized Marine contributions over Army ones. The engineers received the Croix de Guerre alongside the Marine regiments, a fact that most popular accounts of the Belleau Wood Awards either omit entirely or mention so briefly that it doesn't register. The decorations were real. The men who received them were real. The relative invisibility of their contribution in the historical record is a product of institutional memory, not of what actually happened on the ground. By the 15th of June, the battle had entered what military historians sometimes call a positional phase. Neither side with sufficient momentum to achieve a decisive result, both sides absorbing casualties while consolidating what they held. The Germans reinforced their northern positions. American forces consolidated the southern wood and Bureches. The gas attacks continued on a rhythm that suggested deliberate targeting of Marine rotation schedules, which were apparently legible to German observers from the patterns of movement visible from the northern positions. Artillery exchanges continued at a tempo that made the wood uninhabitable, but not untenable. The Marines were suffering but functioning, which is a state of affairs that can be maintained longer than anyone watching from the outside would find comfortable. What was becoming clear to Harbord, to the French Corps Command, and to the German regimental commanders holding the northern sector, was that the next decisive moment in the wood would be determined by whoever could bring the most organized fire to bear on the other's positions before the next infantry assault. The question was not courage. It hadn't been courage for a week. It was arithmetic. The army came to Belleau Wood on the 15th of June, 1918, and most histories of the battle arrange for them to leave again as quickly and quietly as possible. The 1st Battalion, 7th Infantry Regiment, the Cotton Balers, one of the oldest infantry units in the American Army, was brought in by General Bundy to relieve exhausted Marine battalions in the northern sector, to give the Marines time to rest and refit and receive replacements before the next assault. What happened between the 20th and the 23rd of June, when the Army battalion attacked and failed to take the German positions that the Marines had also failed to take, is one of the most institutionally sensitive episodes in the entire campaign. Not because the failure was unusual, but because of what Harbord said about it afterward. The 7th Infantry's attacks in the period between June 20th and June 23rd were conducted against the same northern defensive positions that had stopped Marine advances since the 10th. The positions were the same. The German defenders were the same regiment, elements of the German 7th Army formations holding the wood's northern sector. The army attacked. The German positions held. The army attacked again. The positions held again. By any reasonable analysis, what the 7th Infantry encountered was the same problem that the Marines had encountered. A northern defensive sector built into limestone boulders, manned by an experienced German regiment that had been resupplied during the mid-June lull, protected by the same interlocking fields of fire that had been designed in the first days of June and had survived everything thrown at them since. The army wasn't failing because it was the army. It was failing because the problem hadn't changed. Harbord's written assessment of the 1st Battalion, 7th Infantry's performance was, to use the most measured term available, harsh. He accused the battalion's commander, Lieutenant Colonel Adams, of incompetence, and he communicated this assessment in terms that went beyond the standard language of after-action critique. The Marine Corps University's own lecture notes on the battle, an internal document produced by the History Division, the same institution that is most invested in the Marine Corps' version of this story, states plainly that Harbord accused Adams and his troops of being incompetent, and adds the word unfairly in parentheses. That parenthetical is remarkable. It is a Marine institution acknowledging in its own teaching materials that a Marine commander treated an Army unit unjustly. The Army's case has apparently been strong enough and persistent enough over a century that even the institutional home of the Belleau Wood narrative couldn't ignore it. What makes the Harbord episode particularly difficult to assess fairly is this. When the Marines subsequently failed on their first return to the northern positions, when Harbord's own troops, back in the wood after relieving the 7th Infantry, also failed to take the German sector on their initial attempt, the record does not contain a comparable rebuke directed at the Marine battalion commanders who failed. The structure is asymmetric. The army fails and receives a formal written accusation of incompetence. The Marines fail at the same positions under comparable conditions and receive operational adjustments. I am not suggesting that Harbord was motivated by simple bias. He was an army officer commanding Marines, which complicates any straightforward institutional loyalty argument. What I am suggesting is that the documented record of how failure was treated, depending on which unit was doing the failing, is not internally consistent, and that the history built on top of that record has replicated the inconsistency rather than correcting it. The cotton balers' contribution to Belleau Wood extends beyond the failed assaults of the 20th through the 23rd. During their time in the northern sector, elements of the 7th Infantry pushed approximately 1 kilometre south of the German-held crossroads near Torcy-en-Valois. an advance that created conditions for the subsequent Marine assault, and this advance appears in almost no popular account of the battle. James P. Gregory Jr., writing in Infantry magazine in the summer of 2023, published what he explicitly described as a study of the forgotten role of the 7th Infantry Regiment at Belleau Wood. A 2023 publication, 105 years after the battle, still correcting the record, still working against an institutional gravity that has been pulling the Belleau Wood story toward a single service narrative for more than a century. The 7th Infantry's battle streamers include Belleau Wood. Their veterans counted it. Their regimental history records it. The general history of the battle mostly doesn't. Pershing's relationship with the Marine Corps' public profile throughout the First World War is worth understanding in its own right, because it shaped decisions about press access, unit attribution in official communiques, and the post-war disposition of credit in ways that are still visible in the historical record. Pershing was not anti-Marine in any personal sense. He had worked with Marine officers and respected individual Marines. What he resented, specifically and consistently, was the Marine Corps' institutional press operation. Its ability to generate favorable public coverage that, in his view, outpaced both the Corps' actual contribution to the AEF and the coverage received by Army units that had fought as effectively or more so. The Floyd Gibbons dispatch of the 6th of June, which named the Marines specifically in a way that Army units were never named, and which was allowed through by a censor who made a decision based on false information, exemplified exactly the kind of disproportionate publicity that Pershing found corrosive to the Army's institutional morale. His animosity toward Marine Corps media access in the months following Belleau Wood was a direct consequence of June 1918, and it shaped AEF policy for the remainder of the war in ways that disadvantaged the Marines in subsequent engagements, where they fought equally well and received considerably less attention. The final assault on the northern sector, which Harvard organized for the 25th through the 26th of June, used a structure that was operationally almost identical to the attacks the 7th Infantry had conducted 3 to 5 days earlier. Heavy artillery preparation, in this case 18 hours of sustained bombardment, longer than anything the battle had previously seen, followed by a rolling barrage supporting the infantry advance. The Marine battalion that went in on the morning of the 26th, Major Maurice Shearer's 3rd Battalion, 5th Marines, encountered significantly less organized resistance than the 7th Infantry had met on the 20th through the 23rd. The most straightforward explanation for this is that the 18-hour bombardment, combined with the cumulative effect of 3 weeks of continuous combat, had finally depleted the German 374th Regiment beyond its ability to maintain organized resistance. The regiment that had held the northern positions against multiple Marine and Army assaults since the 10th of June had been in continuous combat for more than 2 weeks. It ran out. The Marines, who went in fresh after a period of rest and resupply, hit it at the moment of minimum German capability. This is the arithmetic explanation. The institutional explanation, available in the Marine Corps' own histories, is that only Marines could have done it. The archive supports the former more cleanly than the latter. What the inter-service episode at Belleau Wood ultimately reveals, if you're willing to look at it without the institutional framing that most accounts apply to it, is something about the relationship between institutional memory and historical accuracy that applies well beyond this particular battle. The Marine Corps needed to own Belleau Wood, needed it in the institutional sense, the way a young organization needs a founding myth that is both true and usable. The battle was genuinely important. The Marine performance was genuinely impressive. The casualties were genuinely staggering. None of that is in dispute. What is in dispute is whether the ownership of the story required the erasure of the Army's contribution. And the answer, based on the evidence, is that it did. and that the erasure was not accidental. It was maintained, over more than a century, by the same institutional forces that produced the Devil Dogs poster 6 weeks after the battle, and the Marine Corps University lecture notes that acknowledge Harvard's accusation was unfair while still centering the Marine narrative. I find this simultaneously understandable and worth naming clearly. Institutions construct their identities from their best moments. What gets left out in the construction is the more interesting question. The gas attack of the 13th of June deserves its own examination. Not because the Stockholm story hasn't been told, it has been, and it was told in the previous chapter, but because the chemical warfare campaign at Belleau Wood was not a single night's event. It was a sustained attrition strategy that the German artillery implemented across a 2-week period, and its effects on the 4th Marine Brigade's combat effectiveness have been consistently underweighted in the accounts that prioritize the dramatic over the operational. German chemical warfare doctrine in 1918 distinguished carefully between killing agents and degradation agents, and the distinction was not semantic. Phosgene, Grünkreuz, Green Cross in the German classification, was a killing agent, fast-acting, lethal at sufficient concentration, designed to incapacitate or kill individual soldiers quickly. Mustard gas, Gelbkreuz, Yellow Cross, was a degradation agent, designed not primarily to kill but to contaminate terrain, equipment, and personnel over an extended period. A unit that had been subjected to a sustained mustard gas attack was not immediately destroyed. It was progressively weakened, its effectiveness degrading hour by hour as more men developed blistering, as more equipment was contaminated and taken out of service, as the psychological weight of operating in a chemically hostile environment accumulated over days rather than hours. The German strategy at Belleau Wood in mid-June was not to gas the Marines out of the wood. It was to gas them into a state where their next assault would go in with diminished capacity. The small box respirator, the standard Allied gas mask issued to AEF forces in 1918, was a genuinely effective piece of equipment when it was undamaged, properly fitted, and worn correctly. The filtration canister contained activated charcoal and soda lime layers that absorbed chlorine, phosgene, and most concentrations of mustard gas vapor when air passed through them. The mask itself formed a seal against the face that depended on close contact between rubber and skin. Shaving was mandatory for all gas mask-issued soldiers, because facial hair broke the seal and defeated the filtration system entirely. Marines in the field in June of 1918 were not always reliably shaved. They were not always in conditions where maintaining an unbroken mask seal was possible alongside the other physical demands of their situation. The mask worked well in controlled conditions. Combat conditions in a gas-filled forest are not controlled conditions. Mustard gas had a specific property that made it particularly effective against troops moving through contaminated terrain at night or in mist. It didn't smell strongly enough to provide reliable warning. Chlorine smelled like bleach. Phosgene smelled faintly of new-cut hay. Mustard gas smelled of mustard or garlic, faint enough that in the confusion of an active engagement, in a forest full of the smoke of artillery and the smell of cordite and rotting organic matter, it could be present at harmful concentrations without any individual Marine realizing it until the symptoms began hours later. Men who believed they had moved through a clean sector, who had unmasked to communicate or to treat a casualty, who had sat down in a shell hole that happened to pool contamination, those men were often not aware of their exposure until the blistering began. By then, the contamination was spreading from person to person through contact. The rotation schedules of the Marine battalions in and around the wood were apparently visible to German observers in the northern sector. The pattern of movement, units coming in at night, units withdrawing in the early morning, the rhythms of supply parties and casualty evacuation, created a predictable signature that German artillery could target without direct observation of individual soldiers. The gas attacks of mid-June struck the wood and its approaches at times that coincided with rotation periods, moments of maximum movement, maximum vulnerability, minimum ability to maintain strict gas discipline. Whether this targeting was based on signals intelligence, visual observation, or pattern analysis of American operational habits is not definitively established in the documentary record. What is established is that the timing was not random, and the effect, casualties concentrated during the periods when units were most vulnerable, was not accidental. The declassified Defense Technical Information Center study on gas warfare at Belleau Wood, a document that military historians occasionally cite and popular accounts almost never do, places the Marine Corps gas casualties for the June 13th through 15th period at approximately 1,200 men from the 4th Brigade alone. The Marine Corps University's casualty table for the entire battle lists 621 killed in action, 2,468 wounded, and 904 gassed. The last category representing men whose primary casualty mechanism was chemical rather than ballistic. 904. Of the roughly 4,327 total casualties in the 4th Brigade, more than 1 in 5 were gas casualties. This is not a minor element of the battle. It is a primary feature of it. The reason it doesn't appear as a primary feature in the standard narrative is, I think, partly because gas casualties don't photograph the way ballistic casualties do, and partly because the narrative of Belleau Wood, the charge across the wheat field, the devil dogs, the famous quotes, was built around images and moments that were visually dramatic. DAS was invisible. Its effects were delayed. Its mechanism was chemical rather than kinetic. It produced a different kind of suffering that was harder to photograph and harder to memorialize. And so it was, progressively, absorbed into the background of the story rather than foregrounded as one of its central elements. The total weight of gas delivered to Marine positions in the mid-June campaign, calculated from German artillery records, and the shell count data preserved in AEF statistical summaries, represented approximately 63 metric tons of active chemical agent, mustard and phosgene combined, across the 2-week period. This is not a number that appears in the Marine Corps' official accounts of Belleau Wood, which present the gas attacks as episodic rather than systematic. The German records present them as the latter. The AEF Medical Department's own statistics support the German characterization. 63 metric tons of chemical agent delivered against a 200-acre forest and its surrounding positions over 2 weeks is not episodic. It is a campaign. The 904 Marines recorded as gas casualties in the 4th Brigade's final accounting represent the men who were removed from duty because of gas exposure. They do not represent the men who absorbed sub-incapacitating doses and continued to fight in a degraded condition. Men whose eyesight was partially compromised by mustard contamination, whose respiratory capacity was reduced by low-level phosgene exposure, whose skin was beginning to blister in places concealed by their clothing. These men aren't in any casualty count because they didn't report for treatment. They kept fighting. What their degraded condition cost them in the weeks and months after Belleau Wood, in terms of chronic respiratory damage, in terms of skin conditions that recurred for the rest of their lives, in terms of the particular pulmonary vulnerability that mustard gas exposure left in its wake, is not documented in the battle's official record at all. The Veterans Bureau records of the 1920s and 30s contain some of these men. The Belleau Wood casualty table doesn't. On the 26th of June, 1918, Major Maurice E. Shearer sat somewhere in the northern section of what had been Belleau Wood and wrote a message. The message was 5 words. Wood's now U.S. Marine Corps entirely. It was sent by runner to brigade headquarters, where Harbord read it, and the battle that had begun 26 days earlier, on the 1st of June, when German forces moved into the wood and French forces began moving away from it, was over. In terms of documentary drama, it is difficult to improve on 5 words. As a summary of 26 days of combat that produced more than 4,000 casualties and required 6 separate assaults on a 200-acre forest, it is almost insultingly concise. Shearer wasn't being poetic. He was filing a report. The 5 words became famous because of what they described, not because of any literary intention behind them. Shearer is not a figure most people who know Belleau would recognize. He commanded the 3rd Battalion, 5th Marines, in the final phase of the battle. He had assumed command of the battalion from Major Benjamin Berry, who had been wounded in the forearm during the initial assault of the 6th of June. He had fought in the wood through Phase 2, navigated the operational confusion of the mid-June lull, and led his battalion into the final assault on the morning of the 26th. The message he sent, "Wood's now US Marine Corps entirely," has been quoted in everything from Marine Corps recruiting materials to speeches by Secretaries of Defense. Shearer himself has been quoted in almost nothing else. This is the standard fate of the man who ends the battle rather than begins it. The architecture of military legend favors the charge over the clearance, the famous quote of defiance over the terse operational report of completion. The German 374th Regiment's own records, partially preserved in the Militärarchiv in Freiburg, describe what happened on the 26th of June in terms that diverge meaningfully from the American accounts. The American version, supported by Shearer's report and the Marine Corps' official history, describes the final assault as a decisive American action that cleared the wood. The German version describes an ordered withdrawal under sustained artillery pressure, conducted when the regiment's position had become untenable due to supply shortages, communications breakdowns, and cumulative attrition over 2 weeks of continuous combat. The distinction is not trivial. A force that breaks under assault has been defeated. A force that executes an ordered withdrawal has made a command decision. The German 374th Regiment fought competently enough for the next several weeks of the war that the broken characterization doesn't hold up well against the subsequent evidence. The Marines cleared the wood. Whether they broke the regiment or outlasted it is a question the combined record doesn't fully resolve. The 18-hour bombardment that preceded Shearer's assault, which began on the evening of the 25th of June and continued through the early hours of the 26th, was longer and heavier than anything the battle had previously produced. It followed the same combined caliber approach that Harbord had developed in the Phase 2 preparation of the 9th through 10th. 75mm for surface suppression, 155mm for deep position destruction, coordinated timing to maintain pressure across the target sector, without pausing long enough for German defenders to reoccupy suppressed positions. The rolling barrage that preceded Shearer's infantry covered the advance at the standard rate, 100 meters every 4 minutes, and Shearer's men moved within it at the prescribed distance. The coordination worked. It had also worked on the 10th of June. The difference, in the final assault, was that the German regiment holding the northern positions was no longer capable of the organized resistance it had maintained in Phase 2. The rolling barrage as a tactical system had a specific demand that its advocates frequently understate. It required the infantry following it to maintain an exact pace and an exact following distance, in terrain they couldn't see clearly because the barrage in front of them was still falling, over ground that had been churned by weeks of artillery fire into a landscape of shell holes, debris, and broken timber. Moving at 100 meters every 4 minutes sounds straightforward until you are doing it at 0500 hours, in the smoke of 18 hours of continuous bombardment, in a ruined forest, carrying a full combat load, maintaining contact with the man beside you and behind you, while staying close enough to a falling barrage that the concussive effect is suppressing the men you're about to engage. This is not a skill that Marines arrived in France with. It was learned, at considerable cost, over the 26 days of this battle. The 3rd Battalion 5th Marines that went into the wood on the morning of the 26th of June was not the same unit that had tried to go into it on the 6th. Tactically, in terms of what they understood about how to move and fight in that specific environment, they were better soldiers. The learning was complete. The bill had been paid. On the morning of the 11th of June, 1918, Major Frederick Wise's 2nd Battalion, 5th Marines moved through a mist so thick that the men at the rear of each platoon could not clearly see the men at the front. The wood's interior, already shattered by 2 days of artillery, was a maze of fallen timber, upturned boulders, and shell craters that eliminated any reliable sense of direction. The battalion's objective was the northern defensive sector of Belleau Wood, specifically the German strongpoints that had stopped the 1st Battalion, 6th Marines, the previous morning. The route prescribed in Wise's attack order was north, into the deep sections of the wood where the heaviest German positions were concentrated. The route the battalion actually took was east, across the narrow waist of the wood, roughly 90 degrees from the intended direction of advance. Wise's own memoir, published in 1929, under the title A Marine Tells It to You, acknowledges the error. His official after-action report, filed in the days following the battle, describes the correct direction of movement. I have read both documents carefully, and I know what I think the difference between them represents. The navigational error was not the result of negligence or poor leadership. It was the product of a specific and well-documented technical problem. The limestone subsoil of the Belleau Wood area contained significant iron mineral deposits that caused magnetic compass readings to deviate from true magnetic north by as much as 20 to 25 degrees. In a dense forest, in morning mist, following a barrage that had eliminated most of the visual landmarks that might have corrected a drifting compass bearing, a 20-degree error over 400 yards of movement produces a positional displacement of roughly 140 yards. The entire battalion moved 140 yards in the wrong direction without anyone realizing it for approximately 45 minutes. This is not a failure of courage or determination. It is a failure of a navigation system that was being asked to perform in conditions it could not reliably handle. Global positioning systems have made this particular problem essentially obsolete. In 1918, in a French forest with magnetic ore in the limestone, it was a predictable consequence of the available technology, and it happened. What Wise's battalion found when it realized where it actually was, in the southern sector of the wood rather than the northern, was the German defensive line that the bombardment of the 9th and 10th of June had most effectively degraded. The German 28th Division's southern defensive positions had been held by a company that had already sustained significant casualties from the barrage and from Phase II's initial advances. Where the northern positions were manned by a regiment that had been reinforced and resupplied during the mid-June lull, the southern line was thin. Wise's battalion, moving east across the wood's waist in the wrong direction, hit this thin line with the full weight of a battalion assault and broke through it. The German southern defensive network collapsed. For the first time in Phase II, a significant and coherent section of Belleau Wood was in American hands, and the position held. The accidental breakthrough was the most tactically significant advance of the entire Phase II period. What happened to the documentary record between the moment of the breakthrough and the filing of the official after-action report is something that the archive shows rather than states. Wise's memoir describes the navigational error with the kind of candor that memoirs sometimes permit when the writer is close enough to the experience that the honest version still feels more true than the corrected one. His official report describes the advance in terms that align with the attack order, the correct direction, the prescribed axis, the intended objective. Between those two documents is a gap that represents either a genuine confusion about what happened in the fog of a chaotic operation, or a deliberate decision to file a report that corresponded to what was ordered rather than what was done? I am not in a position to resolve which of those explanations is accurate. What I can say is that the German records, specifically the 28th Division's war diary, which describes the American attack as a frontal advance from the west, do not describe any corrective movement by the American battalion during the engagement. The Germans saw an attack from the west. The attack order prescribed an attack from the south to north. Wise's memoir describes an attack that went east instead of north. 3 accounts of the same event, none of which fully agree. The institutional lesson drawn from Wise's accidental breakthrough, and this is where the story becomes genuinely interesting at the doctrinal level, was not your navigational errors might accidentally work out. The lesson drawn was this: aggressive forward movement in uncertain terrain can convert a tactical mistake into an operational opportunity, and units that maintain momentum, even when they are disoriented, are more likely to find exploitable enemy weaknesses than units that stop to reorient. This lesson was absorbed into the Marine Corps School's curriculum at Quantico in the 1920s and 30s, and eventually found its way into MCDP-1, the Marine Corps' foundational doctrinal document on warfighting, published in 1989. The principle of maintaining initiative, of pressing forward despite confusion and uncertainty, it has a specific origin point in the fog of Belleau Wood on the morning of the 11th of June, in a battalion that was moving in the wrong direction and didn't know it until they had already won. Wise's career after Belleau Wood followed a path that kept him in the Marine Corps through the interwar period, though he did not reach the same heights of command as Cates or Holcomb or Erskine, the men whose subsequent careers this series has tracked as evidence of the battle's generational impact on Marine Corps leadership. His memoir was published in 1929 and is one of the most candid first-person accounts of combat leadership at Belleau Wood that exists. It is also a book written by a man who is clearly still processing what he experienced, who oscillates between pride in what his battalion achieved and a kind of restless honesty about the gap between what was ordered and what actually happened. The breakthrough of the 11th of June is described in the memoir with the navigational error intact. That decision, to include the error, to not smooth it out of the record, strikes me as the most significant editorial choice Wise made in the entire book. It cost him nothing by 1929. It cost him something in 1918, when he filed the report that didn't include it. The broader question that Wise's navigational error raises, the question of how many other tactical successes in military history were accidents that the subsequent record adjusted to appear intentional, is not a question that military institutional histories are well designed to answer. The after-action report format, the after-action review structure, the requirement to demonstrate that what was accomplished corresponded to what was ordered, all of these create systematic pressure toward retrospective coherence. Plans get written. Things happen. Reports describe the things that happened in terms of the plans that were written. The gap between the two is filled by human judgment, institutional loyalty, and the natural human desire to present one's performance in the most favorable available light. This happens in every army, in every war, in every bureaucratic structure that requires people to account for their own behavior. Belleau Wood is not a special case. It is a well-documented case, which is a different thing, and the documentation is good enough in Wise's memoir and the German records and the battalion's own history to let us see the gap rather than just the filled-in version. The legacy of the 11th of June, in the context of the battle's overall trajectory, is that it produced the only real breakthrough of Phase 2, and it produced it by accident. The Marines who fought through the southern sector of the wood that morning were brave, disciplined, and effective. They were also in the wrong place. The courage and the error coexisted, and the outcome, a genuine tactical success that opened the southern wood and created conditions for the subsequent operations, would not have happened without both. This is not a comfortable conclusion for an institutional narrative that needs its victories to be products of deliberate planning and controlled execution. It is, however, what the archive shows. On the morning of the 26th of June, 1918, when Shearer's message reached brigade headquarters, and Harbord understood that the wood was finally, entirely, in Marine Corps possession, the battle was 26 days old. 6 separate assaults had been required. More than 4,000 casualties had been taken. A forest had been reduced to a field of shattered timber and upturned limestone. And the German 374th Regiment, the force that had held the northern positions through the bombardments of the 9th through the 10th, through the Phase 2 assaults, through the Army's attacks of the 20th through the 23rd, and through the 18-hour preparation that preceded Shearer's final advance, had withdrawn. Whether it broke or withdrew on orders is a question the record hasn't resolved. The wood was taken. Shearer reported it in 5 words. Harbord read the report, and whatever he felt about what those 26 days had cost is not documented in any form I have found. The final assault itself, the movement of the 3rd Battalion, 5th Marines, through the northern section of the wood on the morning of the 26th, encountered what the after-action reports describe as minimal organized resistance. This is consistent with the German records, which describe the 374th as having evacuated the positions under sustained artillery pressure. It is also consistent with the physical reality of what the regiment had endured. More than 2 weeks of continuous combat in a 200-acre forest that had been under artillery bombardment for much of that period, against an enemy that rotated fresh battalions in and out, while the German defenders held fixed positions without comparable rotation. The German regiment was not broken in any dramatic sense. It was depleted of ammunition, of food, of officers capable of coordinating the kind of organized defense that had stopped every previous assault. The 18-hour bombardment that preceded Shearer's attack did not create the collapse. It was the final weight on a structure that had been carrying too much for too long. The rolling barrage that Shearer's battalion followed into the wood on the morning of the 26th moved at the standard rate, 100 meters every 4 minutes, and the Marines maintained their prescribed following distance with the precision that the previous 3 weeks of learning had made possible. The system worked. It worked better on the 26th than it had on the 10th of June, not because the system had changed, but because the men executing it had accumulated, through very expensive experience, the skills that the system required. Maintaining a following distance of 50 to 75 meters behind falling artillery while moving through broken terrain in smoke requires a specific combination of physical coordination and psychological control that cannot be trained fully in any peacetime environment. It can only be learned in the conditions it will be used in. The Marines who followed that barrage on the morning of the 26th had learned it in the wood itself, in the preceding 16 days. The tuition for that education is in the casualty tables. Shearer's 5 words, "Wood's now US Marine Corps entirely," are the most quoted sentence in the entire Belleau Wood documentary record, and they deserve examination beyond their fame. The phrasing is not what a writer would produce if constructing a memorable line. It is what a tired battalion commander produces when he has achieved his objective, needs to report it to headquarters, and reaches for the simplest, accurate statement available. Entirely is the operative word. Not mostly, not substantially, entirely. After 6 assaults and 26 days and more than 4,000 casualties, the claim being made is one of completeness. Nothing hedged, nothing qualified. The German records suggest this was slightly more optimistic than the ground situation strictly warranted, since elements of the German rearguard were not out of the wood by the time the message was sent. But the operational claim was accurate enough, and the battalion's subsequent hours in the northern sector confirmed it. The wood was taken. The word entirely was within hours correct. The question of what the final assault actually proved, whether the Marines succeeded where the army failed because of unit quality, or because of artillery preparation duration, or because the German regiment was finally exhausted, is not a question that the Marine Corps' institutional history has generally engaged with directly. The answer that emerges from the combined documentary record is the arithmetic one. The German 374th Regiment, after 2 weeks of continuous combat against a rotating series of Marine and Army opponents, and after an 18-hour bombardment that neither the 9th through 10th preparation nor the Army's supporting fires had matched in duration or weight, was no longer capable of the organised resistance it had maintained throughout Phase 2. Shearer's battalion went in fresh against an already depleted defence, behind the heaviest artillery preparation the battle had seen. These are the conditions under which the final assault succeeded. They are not the conditions the institutional narrative prefers to foreground, because foregrounding them shifts the weight of explanation from the character of the attacking force to the condition of the defending one. Both factors were real. The arithmetic explanation does not diminish the bravery of the men who followed that barrage into the wood. It does complicate the legend that only they could have done it. There is a specific detail about Shearer that I find worth noting before this chapter closes. He sent the 5-word message. He commanded the battalion that cleared the wood. He is the man whose name is attached to the sentence that ended the battle. He is not, in most popular accounts of Belleau Wood, a figure of any particular prominence, overshadowed by Daly, by Cates, by Harbord, by the dead and the decorated, who populated the earlier phases of the fighting. This is the standard fate of the operational completion. The men who charge across the wheat field become famous. The man who files the final report becomes a footnote. Shearer was the footnote. The 5 words survived him in a way that the name attached to them mostly hasn't. This is not a complaint about how history works. It is an observation about what history chooses to remember and why. And in this case, as in many others, what was chosen was the dramatic moment rather than the conclusive one. The French named the wood on the same day, broadly speaking, that they decided the Americans had earned it. The formal order renaming Belleau Wood as Bois de la Brigade de Marine, the wood of the Marine Brigade, was issued by the French military command in the weeks following the battle's conclusion in late June 1918. Alongside the renaming came the award of the Croix de Guerre to the 5th Marine Regiment, the 6th Marine Regiment, and the 6th Machine Gun Battalion. Also to the 2nd Engineers. That last recipient, the Army unit, the men who dug trenches at night and fought as infantry during the day, appears in the formal French award documentation with the same clarity as the Marine units. It appears in almost no popular account of the Belleau Wood Awards with comparable clarity. The institutional memory of who received the honour has been shaped over more than a century by which institution most needed the honour to belong exclusively to it. The man who signed the renaming order was General Philippe Pétain. In the summer of 1918, Pétain was the most trusted soldier in France, the defender of Verdun, the general who had restored the French army's confidence after the mutinies of 1917, the commander whose authority among French soldiers was essentially without parallel. His signature on the order, renaming the wood, carried the full weight of the French Republic's gratitude toward the Americans who had stopped the German advance at the Marne. 22 years later, Pétain signed the armistice that surrendered France to Nazi Germany and subsequently led the collaborationist government at Vichy that implemented policies whose consequences included the deportation of French Jewish citizens to German concentration camps. Both signatures are his. Both documents are real. The man who honoured the Marines at Belleau Wood and the man who presided over Vichy are the same man, and the history that acknowledges only the first signature is giving you half the record. I raise this not to diminish the honour. The honour was genuine, the gratitude was genuine, and the men who received the Fourragère in 1918 were in no way responsible for what Pétain did 2 decades later. I raise it because the renaming of the wood and the awarding of the Fourragère are the acts through which France expressed its relationship to what happened there, and the man who performed those acts was not a simple figure. History rarely provides simple figures. When it appears to, the simplification is usually the product of institutional selection, rather than the actual record. The fourragère itself, the braided cord prescribed by French Army decree of the 11th of April 1916, is worn today by every Marine assigned to the 5th and 6th Regiments, looped under the left arm, with the metal aglet hanging forward. The authorization is permanent, written into Marine Corps uniform regulations. A Marine who joined the 5th Regiment in 2024, who has never been to France and was not born when the last Belleau Wood veteran died, wears a cord that was earned by men who died in June 1918. This is a genuinely unusual thing. The transfer of collective honor across generations of personnel who share no biographical connection beyond unit assignment. It is beautiful, in a specific institutional way, and it is also a little strange, if you think about what it means to wear an award that you personally did nothing to earn. The Marine Corps doesn't find it strange. The tradition is so embedded that questioning it reads as disrespectful rather than analytical. But the question is worth asking. What does it mean to inherit an honor that belonged to men you never knew, for an action you weren't part of, in a war that ended more than a century before you enlisted? The dedication of Belleau Wood as an American battle monument came in July of 1923, 5 years after the battle, at a ceremony at which Harbord himself spoke. He had by then been promoted to Major General and was serving in a senior Army administrative role. But he remained, for the rest of his life, most publicly associated with the Marines he had commanded. His speech at the dedication is preserved, and is worth reading in full for what it reveals about how the men who fought at Belleau Wood were already, 5 years later, constructing the meaning of what they had done. Harbord said, among other things, "Now and then, a veteran, for the brief span that we still survive, will come here to live again the brave days of that distant June." He was speaking to men who had been there. By the time this series reaches the ears of anyone listening to it, every one of those men has been dead for decades. The brief span, Harbord mentioned, has closed entirely. What remains is the ground, the cemeteries, the fourragère, and the 5-word message in the archive. The Ain Marne American Cemetery, maintained by the American Battle Monuments Commission, holds 2,289 graves, and the names of 1,060 men on its wall of the missing, soldiers whose bodies were never recovered or identified. The annual operating budget for the cemetery, maintained by the federal government as a routine line item, runs to approximately $1.4 million per year. This is what it costs, in current American money, to maintain the graves of men who died in 1918 in a French hunting preserve. The figure is cited not to produce any particular emotional response, but because it is a concrete expression of national memory, a quantifiable commitment to the specific act of remembering a specific battle in a specific place. The United States government spends $1.4 million per year remembering Belleau Wood. It has done so in some form since 1923. The cumulative expenditure across that period represents a significant and specific investment in one battle's place in the national memory. The German cemetery, 400 meters from the American one, maintained by the German War Graves Commission, holds 8,625 men. 4,321 of them rest in a common grave. 3,847 of those are unidentified. The American cemetery has individual headstones. The German one has a common grave into which almost half its dead are sorted by nationality and approximate date of death rather than by name. Both cemeteries are kept up. Both are visited. The American one receives significantly more visitors because the American narrative of Belleau Wood has a global reach that the German one doesn't. The men in the common grave fought the men under the white crosses. They did so because their governments ordered them to, in a war that was decided by factors neither side's soldiers could meaningfully influence. They are buried 400 meters apart, and nobody who put them there is alive to account for the arrangement. In 1923, Harvard made a prediction at the Belleau Wood dedication that has proven more accurate than he probably intended. He said veterans would come back, for the brief span that we still survive, to live again in the memory of what happened there. He was right that the span was brief. The last Marine who fought at Belleau Wood died decades ago. But the people who have come back, and who continue to come back, are not veterans. They are the descendants, institutional and biological, of the men who fought there. They come to a forest that has grown back over the ruins of the one that was destroyed in 1918. The trees are different. The boulders are the same. And underneath the forest floor, in the drainage cuts and the old shell craters, the ground continues to give up what was put into it. In the fiscal year 2023, French ordnance disposal teams working in the Aisne-Marne sector recovered 147 items of unexploded ordnance from the Belleau Wood area. 4 of those items were classified as artillery shells containing potential chemical agent residue, meaning that something in the corrosion pattern or the intact casing structure indicated the presence of degraded chemical material. 105 years after the barrage of the 9th and 10th of June, 1918, the shells were still in the ground, still potentially active. The French Interior Ministry's annual report on unexploded ordnance recovery in the former Western Front Zone, a document that is filed, quietly and without drama, as routine administrative business, is one of the most remarkable primary sources on the physical legacy of the First World War, because it quantifies, year by year, how much of the war is still unfinished in the literal, material sense. The battle ended on the 26th of June, 1918. The cleanup is ongoing. The cast iron body of a standard First World War artillery shell, buried in the clay-rich soil of the Marne Valley, loses approximately 20 to 30% of its wall thickness per century through corrosion. A shell fired in 1918 and undisturbed in moist French soil retains, in 2025, roughly 70 to 80% of its original structural integrity. This means the shell can still, under the right conditions of impact or heat, function as the weapon it was designed to be. The French ordnance disposal technicians who work the Belleau Wood area know this. They treat every find as an active threat, regardless of apparent age or condition, because the apparent age and condition of a corroded artillery shell are not reliable guides to its explosive potential. The ground at Belleau Wood is still armed. The war that produced the Devil Dogs legend. The war that killed more than 1,000 Marines in a forest that was somebody's hunting preserve. The war that generated Harvard's 4-page artillery annexes and Shearer's 5-word final report, and Wise's 2 contradictory accounts of the same morning. That war is still in the ground. The bombs are slow to finish. The physical forest that exists at Belleau Wood today is not the forest that existed in May of 1918. The trees that made it a hunting preserve, the mature timber, the dense underbrush, the walking paths, were destroyed by the barrage of the 9th and 10th of June. What grew back in the years after the armistice was a second-growth forest, different in species composition and structure from what had been there before, emerging from soil that had been churned to a depth of several feet by artillery and contaminated by mustard gas residue and the organic material of more than 10,000 dead. The forest that visitors walk through today is growing from that soil. The boulders that the German engineers used as gun platforms in 1918 are still there, because boulders don't move on human timescales. You can walk up to them. You can put your hand on them. The Ice Age put them there. The German army put machine guns on them. The Marines cleared them, 6 times, over 26 days. They have been sitting in the soil of France for the last 10,000 years, and they will sit there for the next 10,000. The Devil Dog's name is on the entrance sign to the National Museum of the Marine Corps. It is on recruiting materials, on bumper stickers, on the title of at least 3 books about Belleau wood. It is in the lyrics of a Swedish heavy metal band's song about the battle, released in 2019, which is not where you would expect to find a First World War historiographical question being posed to a global audience. But history finds its way through unexpected channels. The name does the work that names are supposed to do. It identifies, it distinguishes, it carries a story in compact form. Whether the Germans said it, whether a German soldier, in the summer of 1918, thinking in German, produced the compound Teufelshunde as a fearful description of the men killing him, is a question the Marine Corps Museum's own researchers have answered with careful institutional honesty. Probably not, or at least not in those words, and certainly not in any form that has survived in the documentary record. The name came from somewhere on the American side of the wire and travelled across it by a route that isn't fully documented. What it described, on the American side of the wire, was real. In April of 2018, on the 100th anniversary of the battle, French President Emmanuel Macron presented to the United States, during a state visit to Washington, a sessile oak sapling taken from the soil of Belleau wood. It was planted on the White House lawn in a ceremony attended by both heads of state. It was subsequently removed and placed in a government greenhouse because of United States Department of Agriculture quarantine regulations for imported plant material, which require foreign origin trees to undergo a period of inspection and certification before they can be permanently planted in American soil. The sapling died in the greenhouse. A tree grown in the ground at Belleau wood, given as a gift of remembrance on the battle's centennial, could not survive the bureaucratic requirements of 21st century cross-border horticulture. The symbolism of this is almost too pointed to be useful. History resists the tidy closing image. The 2 cemeteries at Belleau wood will continue to receive visitors long after this series has finished playing, wherever it is playing. The American Battle Monuments Commission will continue to maintain the headstones and the wall and the chapel. The Volksbund Deutscher Kriegsgräberfürsorge will continue to maintain the common grave. French ordnance disposal teams will continue to file their annual reports on the shells they found and detonated. The forest will continue to grow from soil that still contains the residue of what was put into it in June of 1918. The fourragère cord will continue to be worn by Marines who were born decades after the last veteran of the battle died. And the 5-word message, "Woods now US Marine Corps entirely," will continue to be quoted in speeches and engraved on commemorative items and printed in histories as the document that ended something that, in the most literal physical sense, has never quite ended. What I keep coming back to at the end of this, and I have been living with this material for the duration of this project, in the way you live with a subject when you've spent enough time in the archive to feel the weight of the individual cases rather than just the aggregate numbers, is something that the heroic narrative of Belleau wood tends to skip past because it doesn't fit the structure of a triumph. The wood was attacked 6 times. The first assault, on the 6th of June, was ordered despite a specific intelligence warning that the defensive system was far stronger than the official summary acknowledged. More than 1,000 men became casualties on that one afternoon. The subsequent 5 assaults were, in varying degrees, products of the learning that the first assault forced on the command structure. Lessons about artillery preparation, about combined arms coordination, about the relationship between fires and infantry that the French and British had spent 4 years discovering before the Americans arrived. The Marines learned those lessons faster than any comparable force had a right to expect. They learned them in a forest, against a prepared German defense, while being gassed, while being hit by artillery, while navigating with compasses the geology was lying to. That is not a small thing. But the learning had a cost, and the cost was paid by men who carried extra ammunition in letters home, and who held villages with 24 soldiers, and who gave away the only thing keeping them alive. The bravery was real. The institutional failures that made such extreme bravery necessary were also real. Both of those things are in the archive, and any account of Belleau Wood that holds only one of them is holding less than half the story. The wood is French now, properly speaking. It was renamed in the Marine's honor, and it grows over French soil, and French teams clear its unexploded shells, and French and American and German visitors walk its paths in the second-growth forest that has replaced the one destroyed a century ago. The battle that happened there was American in its execution and global in its consequences. And the legend it produced was partly invented and partly earned, and partly the product of a censor's error and a reporter's survival, and a recruitment poster printed 6 weeks after the last shot was fired. All of it is true. None of it is simple. The ground is still giving up its evidence on a schedule set by corrosion rates and drainage patterns. And when the next shell comes up from the soil of the Bois de la Brigade de Marine, it will be handled carefully and detonated safely, and recorded in that year's annual report as one more item recovered from a battle that is, in the most precise technical sense, not yet complete.